Okay then. Hello and welcome to question and answer number 127. So, we're getting up into high numbers. I mean, even with my towering intellect, I can hardly count up to 127. So we're getting up there. And I'm sitting before you looking very shaggy because my beloved barber is of the opinion that in the wintertime, I should have as much facial hair as possible to insulate my face against the bitter cold, which includes the bitter cold of this house, which also explains why I am dressed like a Scandinavian. My beloved sweetheart, bless her heart, second here, bless her heart, is allergic to artificial heat and artificial air conditioning. I don't understand how it's even possible. So we have to have our house in the wintertime no warmer than about 65 degrees Fahrenheit. Because if it gets higher than that, she gets a killer sinus headache. Or in the summertime, if you have the air conditioning set too low, again, killer sinus headache. But if the weather just naturally goes up and down, she seems to be okay. It's just that if you use artificial heat or artificial air conditioning to raise or lower the temperature, then she's wiped out by it. I don't understand how it's possible. If anyone can give advice on how to better deal with the situation, like, for example, to be able to turn the heat up to a civilized level of temperature without wiping out my sweetheart with a sinus headache, feel free to leave a comment in the comments below. So this is going to be a long one. We got lots of questions, so I shouldn't be digressing too much. And I probably should have more than one emergency backup beverage because I think I may need it. So I'm just going to wallow in this, just going to dive head first right into this. And the first question is from Philalethes. And Philalethes says, thoughts on IQ and enlightenment. And I don't think that there really is necessarily a statistically significant correlation between IQ and the likelihood of one becoming enlightened. So I do think that some towering intellectuals are just so addicted to thought, so addicted to their own intellect. They're so vehemently identified with their thoughts that they become a hopeless case. Whereas some people that are not particularly intellectual can become enlightened more easily than some intellectuals. So there may be a certain amount of overlap. I mean, if you're just too stupid, there just may be like some basic things that everyone needs to understand that you just can't get there yet. Maybe. But then again, Eckhart Tolle says that almost all animals are enlightened. So if a frog or a worm can be enlightened, all bets are off on that score. It could be that IQ is like the main obstacle to enlightenment. Nevertheless, there is definitely a difference between intelligence and wisdom. That some very intelligent people are fools and some relatively unintelligent people are sages. The founder of the system of Theravada in which I was ordained, Taungpulu Sayadaw, was just a relatively simple, I mean, not stupid, but like a simple-hearted sort of village person who really was not an intellectual. And he was spiritually advanced, much more so than the average person. So I think IQ can be useful if you also have spiritual talent, but the spiritual talent is more important than the IQ with regard to the cultivation of wisdom. And I shouldn't spend too much time answering each question, much less digressing, because we got lots of questions. So I'm just going to move on to Philalethes' second question, which is thoughts on Gurdjieff and Ouspensky. And those of you who are unfamiliar with Gurdjieff and Ouspensky, Gurdjieff was a Russian philosopher who was influenced by Eastern spirituality and taught a kind of Western philosophy that was pretty much a Western version of Eastern philosophy, and had sort of an ashram and taught the importance of mindfulness and so forth. I haven't read any of his books. I haven't listened to any of the special music that he had composed for his disciples to help them cultivate wisdom. I mean, I've read about Gurdjieff, and some of it, I mean, he really considered it to be important for everyone to have to face their demons, or they have to get triggered. They have to get stuff happen in their lives that they don't want to happen, just because if you just keep it at bay and you never learn to deal with it. So I think it was possibly the previous Q&A, a recent Q&A anyway, where I mentioned that Gurdjieff had at his ashram, or whatever it was that he called it, a certain Russian aristocrat type guy who was very difficult to get along with. And one time his disciples played some practical joke on him. Like they stole his dentures and rolled it in cow shit and then put it back where he had it, something like that. And the guy left in a rage. And Gurdjieff actually went after him, hunted him down, and bribed him to come back, just because he felt like his disciples should have someone really difficult to get along with, just staying there, and they just had to be forced to deal with it. Also, Gurdjieff had this idea that you shouldn't write books that are easy to read, that something like philosophy, especially Gurdjieff's philosophy, which is very valuable, I mean, you should have to work at it in order to really understand it. And I think that may have backfired to some degree, because philosophy, abstract philosophical concepts in general, they're relatively hard to understand. And if you make it any harder on purpose, then you're just putting a wall between like the idea and the person you want to learn the idea, which is not necessarily a good idea. But I really don't have a whole lot to say about Gurdjieff. I don't have anything bad to say about Gurdjieff. I'm unaware of any like sex scandals or anything like that associated with the biography of Gurdjieff. But I really am no authority on the man. And so I'll just move on to Ouspensky. And I have actually read a book by Ouspensky. It was the Tertium Organum. And the Tertium Organum is a very kind of an arrogant title for this book. Because, I mean, the first organum was Aristotle's logic. You know, it was like the first system of formal thought imposed upon Western civilization, pretty much. And then the second organum was, I think it was Sir Francis Bacon with his like invention of scientific method. You know, so that was the second organum was like this second formal system of thought imposed upon Western civilization, which is essentially science. And so then Ouspensky came up with the Tertium Organum, the third organum, which, I don't think it really ranked. It's true that some people hold Ouspensky and his Tertium Organum in very high regard, like the disciples of Edgar Cayce had the Tertium Organum by Ouspensky as like required reading for their classes that they had to attend, that sort of thing. I've heard Ouspensky referred to as a towering intellectual, but I really was not much impressed by his book. I think to some degree you get to a certain level of abstraction and just sort of strangeness of ideas, and people just really can't start differentiating between like good ideas and bad ideas, just because it's so ethereal, so up there, that they really don't have much of a frame of reference to separate the sheep from the goat, so to speak. And so really Ouspensky's Tertium Organum is full of weird ideas. It's just that he wasn't able to really establish any foundation for these ideas, in my opinion. But I mean, one of the main thoughts of Ouspensky's Tertium Organum is that the universe is more than just 4 dimensions. You know, 3 dimensions of space plus time. He's talking about a 4th dimension of space, imagining 4-dimensional shapes, which it may have been what inspired me to start trying to imagine four-dimensional shapes as a monk living in a cave in Burma, which is where I read his book. But I really was not impressed by Ouspensky. I think that people who are not very good at abstract thought considered him to be just this genius, just because these people that had such a high opinion of him really could not tell the difference between good ideas and bad ideas. When you get to the level of like 4D philosophy, that sort of thing, what a three-dimensional world would look like to a 4D being, that kind of thing. Yeah. So Ouspensky, I wouldn't exactly recommend reading Ouspensky. I think Gurdjieff probably was a wiser man, but I think Ouspensky eventually did break with Gurdjieff over some philosophical idea. But that's really about all I know about the two. And so I'm just going to move on to Phil Lathy's third question, which is thoughts on U.G. Krishnamurti. And I read a book called Goner, which was written by like a personal attendant on U.G. Krishnamurti. And U.G. Krishnamurti was like more radical even than J. Krishnamurti. He apparently had some kind of spiritual awakening. And in U.G. Krishnamurti's case, that even caused him to revert to like a prepubescent body type. You know, they didn't describe it in detail, but apparently his genitalia kind of like shrank or something. You know, he became essentially asexual. And he was really, he just pushed it. I mean, he just would do the most unreligious, adharmic stuff as just a way of really just upsetting the whole apple cart of people's beliefs about what is sacred and what is wise and so forth. I read one, I think it was in the book Goner, that U.G. Krishnamurti actually sent a picture to the Dalai Lama of some porn star, like an Indian porn star, having sex with an elephant or something. I mean, it was like a Photoshop picture. I mean, it wasn't like she was actually doing this. And he did it in such a way that it was clear that he was trying to portray the Buddha's mother, who, according to legend, had this dream of a white elephant, you know, and then she got pregnant, probably without having to, you know, it's like practically a virgin birth, at least an asexual pregnancy, that kind of thing. And U.G. Krishnamurti, I mean, he would like hit people and stuff, but Maharaji did that too. So I do have a book by U.G. Krishnamurti that I haven't read yet. So that's of no help in this case. So basically, most of what I know about U.G. Krishnamurti is what I learned from this book, Goner, from one of his disciples. And I mean, it's a matter of what are your criteria for an enlightened being? And we've been discussing this a few times recently, where, you know, you got this spectrum of the ideas of what an enlightened being can be like. And at one extreme, you've got something like Theravada, which insists that in order to become fully enlightened, you have to be like an absolutely perfected saint. You have to have pure morals before you can have pure concentration, before you can have enlightenment. You have to purify your morals before you can purify your mind. And then you have to purify your mind before you can become fully enlightened. And at the other end of the other extreme from that, you got someone like U.G. Krishnamurti or even J. Krishnamurti. That, I mean, it's like outward morals become utterly irrelevant. So from a Theravada Buddhist point of view, obviously someone like U.G. Krishnamurti couldn't possibly be fully enlightened, but I'm not strictly orthodox in my Theravada Buddhism. And so I have to keep an open mind that it is possible to have a fully enlightened rascal. And if U.G. Krishnamurti was fully enlightened, then he was indeed a fully enlightened rascal. He was called like a spiritual terrorist, that he would just deliberately attack any idea that was considered sacred, partly, ostensibly because any attachment to sacredness is going to be an obstacle to enlightenment. Any attachment at all is going to be an obstacle to enlightenment. But with regard to U.G. Krishnamurti, again, I'm no authority on what he taught, but he would be one of those examples of an alleged enlightened being who nevertheless is not a saint. But nevertheless, he had profound ideas. He taught profound things. And so, at the very least, he did have some kind of experience that caused him to be operating at a higher level of consciousness than the average human. But beyond that, I would not venture to make any assertions. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana. And Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana says, what is your personal opinion on why there is something rather than nothing? And I'm not exactly sure where he got the idea that I'm of the opinion that there is something rather than nothing. I've said more than once that about the only teaching of Hegel that I really can take seriously is how he began his dialectic in his logic. And he starts with absolute being, pure being. That's the first thesis. Then the antithesis, which negates the first thesis, is pure nothing. And pure nothing is the antithesis to pure being. Pure non-being is the antithesis to pure being because, as Hegel points out, neither one of them has any discernible content. They just merge into the same thing. And so Hegel starts off with this idea that pure being and pure non-being are the same, totally indistinguishable. That they are essentially synonyms. And in his logic after that, he just assumes that just everything and nothing are the same. So then the synthesis based on this first thesis of pure being and the antithesis of pure non-being is a kind of contrast. That in order for anything to exist, there has to be some sort of perceived contrast between being and not being. So I really am not of the opinion that there is something rather than nothing, because something is just sort of like a subsection of everything or of pure being, and pure non-being are the same. So that's how God created the universe out of nothing, is that all the positives and negatives have to balance out to zero. So, I mean, that's my opinion of why there appears to be something rather than nothing, is that this universe is absolutely infinite. It contains all possibilities. It is pure being, which at the same time is indistinguishable from pure non-being. And then you have to paradoxically divide up the pure being artificially in order to create the seeming of something rather than nothing, or the something as opposed to nothing, because you can't have something without a nothing to compare it with. So I guess I answered that one well enough. I'm going to move on to Siovaksh and Sipad Zidana's next question, which is, how did you cope with the death of your parents? Well, I was in Burma when both of my parents died. One time I was living in a cave in like northwestern Burma, and I had just heard, when I was going for alms round, somebody gave me the news that my teacher, Venerable Pukoku Sayadaw, had died. Taungpulu Chaltsindoya Sayadaw had passed away. So I asked one of my supporters to call one of the Taungpulu tradition's main supporters. He was like the president of the Taungpulu support organization who lived in Rangoon, to call him and find out when the cremation was going to be, because I would like to attend my teacher's funeral. So back in those days, this was like the late 90s, or was it the late 2000s? Yeah. Yeah, I don't remember exactly when it was. It was quite a while ago. It was, no, it was like less than 10 years ago. So it'd be, yeah, it'd be in the 21st century, early 21st century. She has to, back in those days, in order to make a phone call, you had to get on a boat and cross the Chinduan River to a village on the other side of the river where there was a phone. So she gets the boat, she crosses the river, and then she comes back and she comes to visit me. And she said in this super soft, gentle voice, I have some bad news to tell you. Do you want to hear it? And just right then, I knew my father probably had died. And it turned out, yes, indeed. Not only did my teacher, Venerable Pakoku Sierra, die, my father died around the same time or a little bit earlier. By the time I found out about it, he'd already been passed away for at least a week. So, I mean, my father didn't even want a funeral. There wasn't a funeral. And so I was pretty much stuck in a cave in Burma anyway. And really, I never cried when either of my parents died. I just felt like there was like this hollow feeling in my chest that lasted for maybe 10 days to 2 weeks that I experienced when I found out that my father had died. And in his honor, I read a story from a book that I pilfered from his library, that he allowed me to pilfer and not exactly steal it. But it was a book that he had of short stories. Then he had it since before I was born. I still have it on the bookcase back there. And there's a story by Jack London called To Build a Fire, about a man who freezes to death in the Arctic because his hands are too numb for him to build a fire. And I just sort of read that in my father's honor. And then I set up, like, on the shrine in my cave, there was this big Buddha shrine. And so I set up a picture of my father and put little flowers in front of it for a week or so. And I sincerely missed him. I was sorry that I'd never see him again, not in this life anyway. But, I mean, that's really all I could do. And, I mean, as a Buddhist, you're supposed to reflect on the inevitability of death, that sort of thing. So, I mean, that was it. And then with my mother, I was in Rangoon at the time. And I get this distraught email from my brother saying that my mother had died. And to this day, all I know about how she died was she was getting old. Her reflexes weren't so good anymore. She lost her balance. She fell down in a parking lot, like a public parking lot outside of a store or something, hit her head on the pavement, and that was it. And so with regard to my mother dying, in a way, I was thankful that she had died so quickly and mercifully because she was afraid of death. My father was not afraid of death. He used to say he was curious about what was going to happen after he died. He firmly believed in reincarnation. He claimed to believe some of his past lives or to remember some of his past lives. He was cool. I didn't have any worries about him. But my mother, as a monk, I couldn't really be a good son to her. I'm thinking about, what happens if she needs somebody to be taking care of her, wiping her behind after she goes to the bathroom, feeding her, this kind of stuff. And I was kind of bracing myself for, well, even though I'm a monk, it is my duty. I haven't been a very good son because I've been living in a cave in Burma for the last 20 years. But, I should do what I can. And then all of a sudden, boom, she just falls down, hits her head, and she is moved on to whatever comes next. And I wasn't happy about it, but still in a way I was relieved at the idea that this person that I loved, who was afraid of death, didn't really have to face it. She didn't have some long lingering illness, anything like that. It was just boom. And the other thing that really bothered me was, why am I not more bothered? With regard to my mother and my father, I had a much closer connection with my father, that he considered me to be a reincarnation of his own father, that we had like karma going back into previous lives. With my mother, I mean, we lived on different planets since I was about 12 or 13 years old. I kind of outgrew her. She was, like, spiritually speaking, still kind of a toddler. She was not spiritually advanced at all. And so in her case, I felt like the duty of a son, that kind of a thing. But with my father, it was more a matter of losing one of my best friends. So again, I couldn't go to my mother's funeral. I was a monk with no money, stuck in Burma at the time. So really, there wasn't a whole heck of a lot I could do other than try to console my grieving brother. And so now I am an orphan. And I'm just going to move on to Siovak and Sipa Zidana's third question, which is thoughts. And then he's got the link to some article from sciencealert.com entitled HMPV, What to Know About the Respiratory Virus Outbreak in China. So apparently there's some new respiratory virus making the rounds in China. And according to the article, it was discovered in the Netherlands in 2001, although they have located antibodies to this same virus that go back at least as far as the 1950s. So this virus has been around for a while, and it's not particularly dangerous. It's sort of like a common cold. And it's just this relatively newly discovered virus, I guess, that is people are catching in China. And really, I mean, I don't have many thoughts on it. It doesn't surprise me at all that there's these obscure cold-like viruses that are out there. And every once in a while, some of them will become more well-known because some people are catching it. But really, I don't have a whole lot to say about it because, it's just like another cold virus. Like a new strain of common cold discovered in Peru. It's like, so what? What else is new? There's just add that to the list of things that a person inclined to worry can worry about. So, if I ever catch it, it might seem more important. But right now, it's just sort of like a new strain of cold virus that is making the rounds in China. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Raphael. And Raphael says, what was your impression of Padmasambhava's biography after reading it? And it is true that many years ago, I did read a biography of Padmasambhava, who's considered to be like the second Buddha to Tibetan Buddhists, that he is considered to be like one of the founding fathers of Tibetan Buddhism, of Vajrayana. And again, Padmasambhava was sort of like U.G. Krishnamurti in a way, that he was tantric. It's been many years since I read the biography. I vaguely remember there was a part where he and a woman were living in a cemetery, and if not feeding on actual corpses, at least they were feeding on food offered to the dead at this cemetery. And of course, this monk living alone with a woman in a cave, that kind of stuff, is just sort of flouting traditional Buddhist ethics. And then there's the case that I mentioned not long ago, maybe in the previous Q&A, about Padmasambhava dancing on a flat roof in a town, monks dancing, again, not approved of in early Buddhism. And he just sort of haphazardly kicks a rock off the roof, which flies off the roof, falls down below and hits a guy in the head who's walking down past the building and kills him instantly. And so Padmasambhava just denied that he had killed anyone, because really, I mean, it was just sort of like this act of God or act of karma where, he wasn't trying to kill anyone. He just happened to kick a rock while dancing and it killed somebody. And Padmasambhava experienced no regret or remorse. He freely admitted to what he did, but he was supposedly already enlightened at the time. So, what can you do? And so I think a lot of his biography is probably just made up legends, as is the case with a lot of pre-modern biographies. But I mean, he made enough of an impression on Tibetan Buddhism that he probably was in real life relatively wise. Whether he was fully enlightened or not, I have no way of knowing. But I mean, it was one of those things that you can read that challenges your beliefs about what wisdom is all about, what enlightenment is all about, what Buddhism is all about. So for that reason, I could recommend it. The edition that I was reading was in one of those. There was a series of Buddhist translations with commentary by Evans Wentz was the last name of the person, and he would have heavy hitter Western philosophers doing the intros, like Carl Jung did intros. It was the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation was part of this series. The Tibetan Book of the Dead was part of this series, and also the Songs of Milarepa was part of this series. I think it might have been in the Songs of Milarepa, where there was the autobiography of Milarepa, and also I think possibly the biography of Padmasambhava, although now that I think of it, it may have been in the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation, because Padmasambhava is considered to be the author of the Tibetan Book of the Great Liberation. Whether he really was or not, I have no way of knowing. There are a lot of texts that become popular are just attributed to famous sages of the past as a way of lending authority to them. You know, like Mahayana Buddhist texts as a general rule are, you know, sort of forgeries that are put into the mouth of Gotama Buddha or some other great Mahayanist sage. So with regard to Padmasambhava's biography, yeah, I mean, it's, if you like to have your beliefs challenged, which is good. I like having my beliefs challenged to some degree. Yeah, I mean, it's worth reading. Just if only for the sake of being more literate in Buddhism, knowing who Padmasambhava was, for example. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Raphael. He says, your thoughts on the interpretation of Pure Land by Venerable Master Hua. And he just has this quote here. Master Hua says, quote, fundamentally, there is no heaven and there is no pure land. People believe a heaven and a heaven exists. They imagine the existence of a pure land, and a pure land exists. The Pure Land Dharma door was spoken by the Buddha in order to teach you to do away with your false thoughts. It is intended to lead you to a realization of the pure, inherently wonderful, true suchness nature. At the ultimate point, when you have no false thoughts or confused ideas, you arrive at the Pure Land. Whoever can do away with their false thoughts can reach the land of ultimate bliss. Whoever cannot do this is still in the evil world of the five turbidities. So heaven is the same. We imagine how fine and wonderful heaven must be, but only on the basis of what we have heard. We also imagine the Pure Land to be as the Buddha said it was. We haven't yet seen it ourselves, except in our imaginations. As I see it, the Pure Land Dharma door is taught only for the sake of causing you to purify your mind. That is the Pure Land. If your mind has no confused ideas, that is heaven. If you look for it elsewhere, you show only your greed. Well, he seems to be confusing heaven with nirvana in this case, it seems to me. His description of heaven seems to be more applicable to Buddhist idea of nirvana than Buddhist ideas of heaven, which are still samsaric realms just higher than this one that we are in right now. Also, I would disagree that he says the Pure Land Dharma door was spoken by the Buddha. I don't think that the historical Gautama Buddha taught anything about Pure Land Buddhism, that was made up hundreds of years later after the time of the Buddha. And it says here, the Pure Land Dharma door was spoken by the Buddha in order to teach you to do away with your false thoughts. But in my opinion, belief in the Pure Land is a false thought. So it'd be sort of fighting fire with fire at best. But a lot of Mahayana Buddhism is of the opinion that Dharma is like fighting fire with fire. It's fighting delusional ideas with other delusional ideas that are just less delusional. You know, it's sort of like there's a text, the removal of distracting thoughts. I think maybe it's in the Majjhima Nikaya, where a carpenter will knock a big peg out of a piece of wood with a smaller, narrower peg. And it's kind of like that. You're driving like this gross diluted thought out of your mind with a somewhat less diluted thought. But still, you got to get rid of both pegs. And let's see here. First of all, I would disagree with Master Hua that the Buddha actually taught Pure Land Buddhism. I really do not think that Gautama Buddha, the historical Gautama Buddha, taught Pure Land Buddhism. Let's see. Also, let's see. At the ultimate point, when you have no false thoughts or confused ideas, you arrive at the Pure Land. Well, I mean, he seems to be like equating heaven and Pure Land with nirvana. Because if you have no false thoughts or confused ideas, you're essentially enlightened. I mean, you're even beyond heaven at that point. So it's a way of rationalizing the existence of a teaching of Buddha that wasn't really taught by the Buddha, but Mahayana Buddhists, as a general rule, are not willing to admit that Mahayana Buddhism wasn't really taught by the Buddha. And so they come up with these rationalizations that have to stretch and twist things a bit, where he is like redefining Pure Land Buddhism, essentially, just to kind of make more sense from a classical Buddhist philosophical point of view. And I don't think he does a very good job of it. So I'm just going to move on to Raphael's third question, which is as follows. Despite their often simple way of thinking, I value the humility of deeply religious people more than the arrogance of some intellectual atheists who believe they know everything better. Is this also your conclusion after becoming familiar with the Western world and the Burmese people who have a traditional Middle Age, it's like medieval religious mindset? Yeah, I can appreciate religious people, especially people who are not extremely wise do well to just commit themselves to a pre-established spiritual dogma. The average person is not going to come up with their own independent thoughts that are wiser or better as a general rule than the religion in the culture of which they live. So it takes kind of a person with somewhat unusual talents or somewhat unusual intelligence to really break away from the mainstream of like orthodox dogma of whatever religion it is that they're in and try to make better sense of stuff. So yeah, I wrote an article. It's in one of my books. I think it's in my book, Philosophical Dharma, about comparing religion to poetry. How back in the day, poems, like in the English language especially, not only had meter, but they rhymed. There was like this structure. It was very limiting structure. You know, you have whatever you're going to say, it has to fit this rhythm of da-dun, 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 da-dun. And also, if you're into rhyming, it's got to rhyme. And some poets got so good, like, for example, Coleridge with his poem Kubla Khan, it just occurred to him spontaneously. He wasn't trying to work out what rhymes with what. It just appeared in his mind while he was on drugs, as it turns out. But I mean, once like a talented poet back in pre-postmodern times, you know, somebody like Shelley, I mean, you just get so used to working within the framework of meter and rhyme that you just can spontaneously start creating this beautiful inspired poetry with meter and rhyme without having to like work out exactly what word's going to fit in there and this sort of thing. It just happens spontaneously. And following a traditional religion is kind of like that. You know, it's sort of like, you know, you're bound by these limitations of meter and rhyme, so to speak. But I mean, what happened after poetry stopped having meter and rhyme? I mean, I think Walt Whitman was one of the main perpetrators of that in English literature anyway. He just started writing poetry that had no meter and no rhyme. And that just opens the door, just flings the door wide open to untalented pseudo poets writing bad poetry. And I mean, they don't even have to make it fit anything. And that's kind of the way Western religion is becoming, where there's just no structure, no rules, pretty much. And I think a good poet with meter and rhyme is going to be better than a good poet without meter and rhyme. And a good, like a religious person with this traditional framework is, most cases, I think, going to be better than a spiritual person who just has no use for frameworks, like U.G. Krishnamurti, for example. I mean, U.G. Krishnamurti, he can get away with that stuff. Picasso could get away with paintings that didn't look like anything. Whitman could get away with poetry that didn't have meter or rhyme. And so U.G. Krishnamurti is kind of like that. He can get away with spirituality with no rules. But I do think that, the poetry that is the most beautiful has meter and rhyme. And also, like, the religion that is most beautiful has this framework that adds structure and stability and, like, balance and so forth, which for most people is best. It's going to be outliers who are going to do better than the pre-established structure by just going out on their own. So let's see. What is the question? Is this also my conclusion that, despite their often simple way of thinking, I value the humility of deeply religious people more than the arrogance of some intellectual? Yeah, the people of Burma were some of the most virtuous, like the people around my monastery of Wonbo Forest Monastery on the Chindwen River, about 16 miles upriver from Monua, the city of Monua in Burma. They're the most virtuous people I'd ever dealt with in my life. And their life had a certain simple beauty to it that I really admire and respect. And you come back to America where people say that they're Buddhist and don't keep 5 precepts and don't meditate very much and still call themselves Sangha and all this. And yeah, I'd have more respect for the Burmese approach, despite its limitations, because you can get so locked into a dogma. You just have this medieval mindset. You can't question anything that you are taught. It's just all has to be gospel truth, literally. It didn't work for me, because I just am not that way. I'm not that way in religion, not that way in politics. I can't just follow a religion or a party and just accept everything. It just doesn't work. I've got to think for myself. I've got to follow my own conscience, my own best judgment, that sort of thing. But still, I do have a lot of respect for deeply religious people in Burma, and also deeply religious people in South Carolina, who for the most part are Baptist Christians rather than Theravada Buddhists. But still, it's like they carry their religion around with them all the time. It's just inside them that they're kind of living their life more or less in religious terms. At least there's a religious tinge to their everyday experience. Just their humbleness, their honesty, that kind of thing, that I have to respect that, even though I'm not a Christian. I'm not really all that great of a Theravada Buddhist either, for that matter. Even when I was a strict monk, still I was a heretic, just because I did not believe everything in the texts, like the entire third Pitaka, for example. So anyways, I'm just going to move on to the next question. I can't really spend a lot of time on each question just because there's lots of questions, and we want to keep this to less than 3.5 hours if possible. So, next question is from Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam and occasionally still known as Lieberlam. And he says, how long do you suppose that the most scholasticism-obsessed scholar monks spend studying on the average day in Burma? Well, I would say the most scholasticism-obsessed scholar monks, they're pretty much spending all day. Probably even when they're eating. Like, there is a phenomenon in Burma called the Tipitaka Dara, the bearer of the Tipitaka, which is monks who have memorized by heart the entire 40-volume Pali Tipitaka in the Burmese edition. And, they'll even be eaten and they'll just be like reciting over and over in their head, just trying to keep it all memorized and memorize new stuff if they haven't memorized it all yet. There's a monastery that specializes in cranking out Tipitaka Dharas. I think at the time I was in Burma, there were like 6 of them. That 6 monks who had memorized the entire Tipitaka. I think one of them actually was protesting against the government at one point and got thrown in prison. I think he may have been forced to disrobe somehow. But I have met at least one of these Tipitaka Dharas. And really, it's like they're like chanting in there, at least internally, like under their breath, pretty much all the time, just so that they don't forget the 40 volumes that they have memorized, or if they're still memorizing it, you know, they're doing it even more probably. With regard to the ones that aren't just memorizing, still, I mean, it's going to be like most of the day, like it'd be like sort of an intensive meditation retreat where you're meditating most of the day. These monks, these scholar monks in Burma are like in an intensive scholasticism retreat pretty much all the time, and they're just like studying it. And they do have this medieval attitude that it's all gospel truth. It was all taught by the Buddha. It's the highest truth. They can't question any of it. Like, I mean, sometimes it just results in these weird kind of cognitive dissonance experiences. Like the most famous Tipitaka Dhara in Burma was Mingun Tipitaka Dhara Sayadaw, who was he was the reciter at the Burmese Sixth Council in 1956. He recited the Tipitaka at the Burmese Sixth Council. And he knew that the Buddha was not really considered to be extremely tall in the texts. You know, there are many cases, people see the Buddha, they think he's an ordinary monk. The Buddha exchanges robes with Mahakassapa, that sort of thing. But at the same time, the Buddha was considered to be 27 feet tall. In the commentaries say the Buddha was 27 feet tall. So Mingun Tipitaka Dhara Sayadaw, who was no idiot. I mean, the man was brilliant, just a phenomenal scholar. Like many Burmese Sayadaws are just phenomenal scholars. They've memorized so much of this stuff. They can just recite chapter and verse just spontaneously. He had to have this theory. He could not doubt what the commentary said even, that the Buddha was 27 feet tall, but he knew all the evidence from the text that the Buddha really, he may have been tall, but he wasn't like taller than a giraffe, tall as a tree. So he had to come up with this theory that in the Buddha's time, people were more virtuous than now, even though they were like mass murderers and sociopathic kings and so forth. People were more virtuous than now. And so the weather gods loved people more than they do now. And so they brought more seasonal rains, more clement weather, which caused the crops to grow better. They were more nutritious. And so everybody was, 12 to 15 feet in height at least. And he could not question even like really obvious stuff that can't be true. I mean, he just, despite his brilliance, he was in the Guinness Book of World Records, or so I've been told, for memorizing the entire 40-volume Pali Tipitaka, including extra stuff like commentarial stuff, polygrammars. I mean, he had like a photographic memory. But he was limited by his dogma. He had to believe stuff that, I mean, even a 10-year-old child couldn't believe in the West just because we have different cultural conditioning. But I've deviated from the question here, and I would just say, several hours a day, most of the day, they would be studying. Phenomenal scholars in Burma, although they are dogmatic phenomenal scholars. And I'm just going to move on to Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Libraham's next question, which is, do you suppose that non-percipient beings would have some ordinary scale of experience in terms of temporality on the grounds that there is an interstition to separate moments of hypostatic bhavanga in the form of feelings with their impulsion that goes beyond non-percipient space? Libralam is like this. He writes stuff that's even harder to understand in the Discord server. So, do I suppose that non-percipient beings would have some ordinary scale of experience in terms of temporality on the grounds that there is interstition to separate moments of hypostatic bhavanga? Well, bhavanga is like the subconscious mind, the closest thing that Orthodox Theravada has to a subconscious mind, like in a Freudian sense, would be bhavanga, which is just, it's like your last conscious memory in your previous existence, which comes over into this existence as a kind of test pattern. Like if you're sound asleep, you're not thinking anything, you just have this image in your mind. That's bhavanga chitta. Every thought moment begins and ends with bhavanga chitta, which may be the image of your family looking down at you on your deathbed in your previous life just before you die, something like that. But you don't remember that. So the thing is, I think one of the things Lieberlam, or Stellar Supreme, formerly known as Lieberlam, is suggesting here is that you would notice a passage of time even though you're supposedly unconscious, simply because these bhavangas are happening one after another, and it's like one bhavanga, it's like one image, another the same image, another the same image, but they're at least repeating, and so you'd notice the repetition. But you're not aware of any gaps, because the gaps, there's no mind in between the gaps. So you wouldn't be aware of the gaps, that it all just converge into one bhavanga. And if nothing is changing, then there's no passage of time. It could be there'd be like some kind of fluctuation, although Abhidhamma doesn't say this. And still, you wouldn't be able to perceive the bhavanga. See, that's part of the problem, is in order to perceive anything, it takes 17 mind moments of all these different processes just to perceive one image. Just even one pixel of one image. And there's none of that if all you've got is bhavanga. So there's this bhavanga that's in a way, it's not even really a perception. You know, your mind doesn't advert to it. It's just sort of just background filler for when you're unconscious, or as unconscious as you can possibly be without being an inanimate object. So let's see here. In the form of feelings with their well, there wouldn't be any feelings, because Vedana isn't arising when all you've got is bhavanga. If Vedana arises, perception also has to arise. Cetana also has to arise in accordance with Abhidhamma. But if it's a non-percipient being, there's going to be no awareness of the passage of time, because the passage of time is itself perceptual. You have to compare two events in time and like perceive a distance between those events in time in order to have a concept of time. So I don't suppose that. And I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from Gnostic Rocker. And Gnostic Rocker says, I have heard you speak about magical otherworldly experiences from your youth. Have you or any of the monastics you have spent time with over the decades experienced any of these transformative otherworldly perceptions in adult life? I understand it is against Vinaya for monastics to boast of these to lay people, but hope you'll be able to discuss it now that you are a layman. Well, I've had mystical experiences. I mean, the first mystical experiences I had were probably as a child. You know, just seeing the whole world as a child sees it is kind of mystical to begin with, because you haven't like locked in everything with names and categories and everything. So you're just kind of seeing it all for the first time in a sense. Then as I was getting older, in my teens and early 20s, mystical experiences were generally triggered by psychedelics, especially LSD. And then when I became a monk and started meditating intensively, after several years, I got good enough at meditation that I started having mystical experiences in meditation also. But I don't know how really to describe it. I mean, you can't really describe it very well. It's just your mind is clear like glass, in the meditative sense, and you're just wide awake. You're more conscious than you normally are. But how do you describe that? I'm not sure. I mean, you just have no doubt that this is more real than the ordinary waking state of consciousness. See, maybe I should just go over this question a little better here. I've heard you speak about magical otherworldly experiences from your youth. Have you or any of the monastics you have spent time with over the decades experienced any of these transformative otherworldly perceptions in adult life? Yeah, I mean, most monks, they're not really going into details, and most monks probably don't experience much in a mystical sense, especially Asian monks who are, they're just doing their cultural thing by being a monk. Most of them really do not have a spiritual calling, in my opinion. Transformative otherworldly perceptions. So that wouldn't include just paranormal stuff, I assume. That he seems to be talking about like expanded consciousness, higher levels, higher realms kind of stuff. And with regard to Burmese monks, I haven't really talked about that sort of stuff, that kind of stuff much. And generally, yeah, I haven't really spoken with people that have described to me in detail. At least I don't remember it. But I'm sure that I'm not the only one, that there are plenty of Western monks out there who must be at least as good of meditators as I was, that there are a lot of very saintly Burmese monks, even though the majority may not be saintly. There are some, it's like in medieval Europe, where most Catholic monks and priests were not particularly spiritual, but still you had some genuine saints walking the earth. People who just could not doubt their religion. And in the Catholic, medieval Catholic idea, it's like you only get one chance at heaven. And if you blow it, you're going to burn in hell forever and ever. So they had that kind of pushing them towards saintliness in a way that Buddhists don't have that. And so, how can I discuss it though? Yeah, I mean, you can't really, at least in my experience, mystical experiences, it's just like an expansive, hyper-conscious state, and it doesn't go into words very well. So, yeah, rather than spend another 5-10 minutes just kind of stumbling over my words trying to explain what ultimately is unexplainable, I guess I'm just going to move on to Gnostic Rocker's next question, which is, over the years, I have noticed that what people are in their lay life is frequently what they carry over into their ordained life. Thus, we have many different kinds of Dhamma, depending on what prism the layperson brought with them to the temple. Thus, if a layman was heavily into Jung and New Agey stuff, that's the kind of Dhamma he teaches. If someone was a badass disciplinarian, severe military type in lay life, that's the kind of Dhamma he teaches as a monk. If someone had a strictly dour, austere Protestant upbringing, that's the kind of Dhamma he teaches. If someone was a bit of a what's your angle streetwise hustler, that's his Dhamma, etc., etc. Is there any way around this? Is it inevitable, and does it even matter? Well, it's not inevitable, because sometimes it's like you'll sort of, you'll be this sort of person, and then you'll have some life-changing insight that will cause you to just shift, at least in certain respects. Like the heavily into Jung and New Agey type of person who then is inspired to become a monk, they might just leave behind the New Agey Jung stuff and just become like very dogmatic with regard to Theravada. I mean, that does happen. You've got some people that are dedicated to one thing, and then they become disillusioned with that, and then they change over to Theravada, and it may be that personality type of just like wholly committing to this system, it remains intact. It's just that the system changes. So like certain aspects of their personality can change. I mean, there's a lot of cases of people who are just like very angry, getting into fights kind of stuff. And then they have some sort of awakening experience that inspires them to be more religious or spiritual, and they can just leave that behind. Sometimes it happens, but it takes like a crisis. It takes like something to just slam you out of a rut. And then in most cases, you just find a new rut. So, it is true that you're stuck being who you are as a general rule. So if you're a cynical smartass before you become a monk, good chance you're going to be a cynical smartass monk. You're going to be, whatever it is, your personality pretty much remains the same. And like your cultural conditioning, you can't just leave that behind. I learned that through experience, that I could not become an ancient Indian monk, no matter how closely I would try to follow the ancient Indian texts on how an ancient Indian monk is supposed to live and conduct his life and his behavior and everything. Still, I was born and raised in the United States of America in the 20th century, mostly. So you're just stuck with that. And so for the most part, it's true. And whether it matters or not is kind of irrelevant because it's just the way it is. And just most of it is inevitable, except for in some cases, someone will just hit this totally disillusioning crisis that will cause them to let go of whatever it is they were clinging to. And, in most cases, they just start clinging to something else. In this case, to Theravada Buddhist monasticism and a certain amount of dogmatism and so forth. Like I knew this Australian monk that, he was just this rascal. He was living in Thailand, just kind of living this sort of like a degenerate kind of existence, just making money, scoring with Thai girls, drinking every day, this kind of thing. And I'm not exactly sure what it is that happened, but he had some kind of crisis. And he became a monk to save himself from himself and just became this very humble, very devout, very serious monk instead of just this debauched party animal that he was before. So, even though it usually happens that you just take your personality before you were a monk and you just are the same personality after you become a monk, except you just, switch jobs essentially. That's usually the case, but not absolutely always. And there's really not a whole hell of a lot you can do about it. You just make the best of what you can. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is also from Gnostic Rocker. And he says, I'll keep the following as brief as possible because I don't want to project my own views or project papancha. What's your view of Westerners and obsessive ritualization around hierarchies based on henpecking and relentless bowing as a means of establishing transactional relationships with others? I won't say any more on that. I am interested in your view, not more on my own projections. I won't ask about Easterners bowing ritualization. It's so much part of their culture, but it's not ours. So I don't fully understand this question. Maybe because he was too brief. I'm not sure. But what is my view on Westerners and obsessive ritualization around hierarchies based on henpecking and relentless bowing as a means of establishing transactional relationships with others? I really don't have a lot of experience with that because I never really liked ritualization. I was never much into rituals. That's one reason why I became a Theravada Buddhist, because of all the schools of Buddhism, it seems to have a minimum number of rituals that are prescribed by the texts themselves. Maybe I could be wrong. I went to a Zen monastery once as a layperson looking for a monastery, and there was so much. You had to bow to the doorway before you went into the doorway. You had to bow to the room as you were entering and leaving the room. If there was any Buddha statue, you'd have to bow to that. Just bowing and chanting. There's lots and lots of it. I had no use for it. In Theravada Buddhism, you only have to bow if you meet a senior monk. You have to bow to any monk who's been a monk longer than you have. So, at first I felt very awkward and self-conscious because Americans generally don't bow to anybody. Half of them hate the president. So, I felt awkward and self-conscious, sort of like I used to feel as a layperson when I would dance without being drunk yet, that kind of thing. But after you've done it a few dozen times, it's just no big deal. It's just something that you're supposed to do, so you do it. You know, it's just proper etiquette for a monk. Nobody forced me to become a monk against my will. I did it voluntarily, so I should follow the rules voluntarily. It's just part of the package, part of the deal of becoming a monk is you got these rules, and one of those rules is you bow to senior monks after uncovering your right shoulder. So, I'm not really exposed a lot to ritualization around hierarchies based on henpecking and relentless bowing as a means of establishing transactional relationships with others. I don't think I've ever really viewed Buddhism that way. I mean, when I read this, the thing it mostly reminds me of is that Zen monastery I went to, which is Shasta Abbey in Northern California, with all this bowing and ritualization, but it didn't strike me as henpecking or establishing transactional relationships with others. It was just tradition. It's just what you're supposed to do, so you do it. So, yeah. Let's see here. It's easier for the Easterners because they live in a more class-conscious society than we do. The Burmese definitely live in a much more class-conscious society than we do. As I've mentioned before, there are half a dozen different pronouns for me, half a dozen different pronouns for you, and the pronouns that you use depend not on gender so much as just the relative social status between the person that you're talking to and yourself. And they can be very grovelly. The Burmese, it's kind of strange how they just willingly grovel to someone who is socially superior to them and then act just like in a very haughty, arrogant way to people who are inferior to them socially, which is strange. And it always kind of struck a weird chord with me. I generally preferred, or often in many cases, I preferred hanging out with the servants of a household than the master and mistress, just because the servants were more humble and cheerful and happy to hang out with me and everything. So, yeah. But this question, I really can't relate to it. My view on Westerners and obsessive ritualization around hierarchies based on henpecking and relentless bowing as a means of establishing transitional relationships with others, I mean, it just wasn't on my radar at all, especially with regard to Westerners. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Al. And Al says, what are your thoughts on the gold-canned Thai Red Bull Kratingdaeng sold in Asia versus the blue silver-canned Red Bull we have in the West? Yeah, that's the first time I ever saw Red Bull I was in Burma. And it was like, I'd been in Burma just a matter of days. And somebody brought me two canned beverages. One was, it was like Sprite or 7-Up, something like that. And the other one was this little gold can of Kratingdaeng 250. And I never liked Sprite or 7-Up. So I thought, well, what the heck? I'll just drink this gold stuff. I didn't know what it was. I'd never seen it before. But the lady who offered it to me says, he likes that. And she started bringing me more of it because she thought I liked it because I picked it over the two. And I think it tastes at least as good as, well, I got a can right here. This is my emergency backup beverage. This is Western Red Bull. I think it tastes better. And at least in the 90s, when I was drinking it at first, I mean, it had ingredients that were probably illegal in the West. I've been told that it had a little bit of nicotine to get people addicted to it. It had some kind of steroids, although even vitamin D is a steroid. So, I mean, it's just because it has steroids in it doesn't mean that it's all that bad. It probably had something along the lines of amphetamine. If you drank more than 2, you weren't going to sleep that night. I mean, you would just get zinged drinking 2 cans of this Kratingdaeng 250. And I guess the story is that some Austrian businessman was vacationing in Thailand and he saw this Kratingdaeng Red Bull. I guess Kratingdaeng in Thai literally translates into English as Red Bull. In Burmese, it's called Chue Yain, which means wild buffalo. So anyways, this Austrian businessman is in Thailand. He sees this stuff and he thinks that's a good idea, like energy drink. So he sort of got permission to use the brand, but the ingredients are totally different. The whole design of the can and everything is totally different. And I mean, it's more legal. And I think now that even the gold can Kratingdaeng 250s, now that it's sort of a internationally famous brand, they've had to tone it down and take out the stuff that would be illegal in the West. And you don't get nearly as zing to drinking it anymore. But I did like drinking it. And I think a lot of the Ajahn Chah monks that do the all-night vigils, on Uposatha night where you just meditate all night long, I think some of them are chemically aided with this Kratingdaeng 250 or some equivalent. There's a lot of energy drinks out now. But I used to really like it. I'd look forward to getting a can or more than a can of Red Bull. That was like the closest I came to taking drugs as a monk for many years, is just drinking Red Bull, chemically aided by 1 can of Buff. I had that as Cabo Cob. It was just like this code in my journal. I was keeping track of like sleep and meditation and so forth, that there'd be like this chemically aided little note that I'd put in there when I'd get Red Bull. And I might as well take a sip of it in honor of Red Bull. So, what are my thoughts on it? I guess those are my thoughts, aren't they? So, I guess I'll just move on to the next question. This is from Trzaskaziz. And Trzaskaziz says, why sometimes it is Gautama, spelled Gotama, and other times it is Gautama, spelled Gautama. Is it like Pali versus Sanskrit difference? And that is correct. Gotama with an O is the Pali way of spelling the name Gautama, and Gautama with a Gau is the Sanskrit way of spelling the name Gautama. So historically, I guess in American culture, Western culture in general, it would be spelled Gautama. But within the context of Theravada Buddhism, which uses the Pali language, it's Gotama. And it's almost the same because, like, for example, the Burmese pronunciation of the letter O is essentially like AU. It's a diphthong, O. Gautama. So it's the same name. It's just that one is in Pali and one is in Sanskrit. And only a Theravada Buddhist, for the most part, would have it spelled Gotama and not Gautama. And so I'm just going to move on to Trzaskaz's second question, which is, it has occurred to me that legends say the Buddha, after getting a rice with milk and honey or whatever it was, sat down under the Bodhi tree with very strong desire to not get up until he became enlightened. That strong desire had not stopped him to wake up. Even abandoning wife and kid to look for an answer to life is some kind of desire. So, is strong desire to wake up a good thing? Well, it's sort of like knocking out the big peg with the smaller peg. You're replacing one like unwholesome desire or a whole bunch of unwholesome desires with a more wholesome desire, a simplified, more wholesome desire, which eventually you do have to get rid of. But I have been for a long time skeptical of this idea that the Buddha sat down under the Bodhi tree with this firm determination he wasn't going to get up until he was enlightened, because that itself is a kind of attachment that I am skeptical of the very idea, because you have that strong of an attachment. You make that strong determination, I'm not going to get up from this seat until I become enlightened. That very determination can be what prevents you from becoming enlightened, because you have such this strong, insistent desire on things being a certain way. And wisdom just doesn't work that way. So I am skeptical that the Buddha had this determination. I think it's what might be more likely is something that would be heresy might be seen as disrespectful, in that he was trying and trying and trying, and then eventually he just gave up. And that's why he accepted the milk rice from Sujata, or whatever her name was. And, his 5 ascetic companions washed their hands of him in disgust because he was eating this dainty milk rice. And it may be that he just kind of gave up on the asceticism, at least this strict striving, and just said, in probably less French terminology, he just fuck it. And then he just sat down to meditate under the Bodhi tree just because he felt like it. And then it was able to happen after he had sort of given up, I wrote an article about it. It's floating around out there somewhere. I think it might wind up in my 5th volume of essays, which I haven't started editing yet. But, yeah, so I do think that you have to have a desire for enlightenment, or a desire to cultivate wisdom at first, and that's part of the raft. And then eventually you have to let go of that, because, eventually it becomes an obstacle, even though it's helpful at first to get you to a certain point. But then after you get to that certain point, you have to let it go. And I do think that you're going to have to let go of that before the moment of enlightenment. A lot of Burmese people think that, you just spontaneously let go of all these attachments at the moment of enlightenment. But I really do think that you got to let go of these things before you become enlightened. Or contrary-wise, they'll think that you don't start acting like a saint until you become enlightened. But you may have to start acting like a saint even before you are one, just to help you get there. So there's this part at the end, even abandoning wife and kid to look for an answer to life is some kind of desire. Yeah, probably. Not necessarily, but probably. And, at first you have this desire for enlightenment. And I've discussed this before, how, it's like the last desire that you have to get rid of. Your last attachment is your attachment for enlightenment. That at first it's skillful because you have this one desire for enlightenment that, it eclipses all your other desires, your desires for, family and social status and wealth and stuff, nice car, sensual pleasures and all that. You replace all of these less skillful desires with this more skillful, simplified desire for enlightenment. And so you strive for enlightenment, and you strive and you strive and you strive. But because you still have this attachment, you still can't become enlightened until eventually you have to just let go of that last attachment, and then you can become enlightened. So I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question, also from Cherzaska's which is how much of a legend of the Buddha is fiction, and how much is likely true events? I would say well over half is fiction or just legend. I don't think necessarily it was deliberately cooked up. It was just stuff that is floating around, weird legends, kind of rumors that then get taken more seriously, and then someone decides, yeah, we better include this. So, obviously, like the Buddha being born, the day of his birth, his mother is standing up under a tree, holding onto a tree. He's born, he immediately takes off walking. He doesn't have any goop on him. He's not this little red screaming baby. He immediately takes off walking, a lotus blossom appearing under each footstep so he doesn't touch the ground. And then he just starts bragging, there's no one greater than me. This is my last birth. And then after that, he just kind of reverts back to being an ordinary baby. Well, I don't think so. The whole thing about the Buddha being 27 feet tall, I just don't think so. There's just a lot of it. And even the stuff in the text with just all these grandiose miracles and the grandiose bragging about how people should worship him and so forth. I think a lot of that is fiction. Even in ancient Greece, most people probably knew that Plato's dialogues were not really coming from the mouth of Socrates. Maybe a few of the earlier ones, like the Apology and so forth. But eventually Plato just started using Socrates as sort of mouthpiece for Plato's own philosophical views. And early Buddhist monks have done the same with the Buddha, where most of the texts of what the Buddha is saying, the historical Buddha probably didn't really say it. A lot of it would be stuff that he wouldn't really disagree with necessarily, but I do not think that most of what you find in the text, and even less of what you find in just the extraneous tradition, is going to be factual accounts of historical objective events in the Buddha's life. So with regard to certain things, there's a good chance he really was born in Kapilavatthu, which was a little city-state in what is now Nepal, that he probably really did die at Kusinara, lying between two sal trees, that kind of thing. Some of the core events, just the really basic stuff. But I think most of the stuff describing the legend of the Buddha is just that. It's like legend and mythology, tradition that got handed down from this nebulous beginning, and a lot of it is just flatly unbelievable to any but the most dogmatic, just credulous sort of Westerners. So, yeah, I'm sorry to say it, but probably at least 90% of the legend of the Buddha is probably not objective history. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Nirmit. And Nirmit says, why do you think Buddhism didn't spread as much as Hinduism in its home country, India? Well, I would say that Nirmit probably is not very well versed in Indian history, because for many centuries, India was a predominantly Buddhist country. That there were times in this Earth's history, like late antiquity, early Middle Ages, somewhere around in there, that most of the Earth's population could have been Buddhist. That was back when China and India and Central Asia were all predominantly Buddhist. And so more than half of the Earth's population at that time would have been nominally Buddhist. But the thing is, when the Muslims invaded India, and at the time that the Muslims invaded India, India even then was probably predominantly Buddhist. But the Muslims who invaded India essentially genocided the Buddhists. That it was one of the worst genocides in human history, even though you don't hear much about it. That the Buddhists, being uncompromising pacifists, had essentially three options. I mean, they could just die. They could run off and hide, in which case there's a good chance they were going to die anyways of starvation or whatever, or they could convert to Islam. So some of them, I assume, converted to Islam, and other ones just wound up dying. And the Hindus, on the other hand, weren't so uncompromising with regard to ahimsa, with regard to nonviolence, because they did have like martial epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. They were like based on like wars. You had military heroes that were deified, like Krishna and Rama, that, in a way, it was just built into the religion that sometimes it is your dharma to fight. Whereas in Buddhism, they just couldn't accept that, and they wound up just getting exterminated. But Buddhism was a predominantly, India was a predominantly Buddhist country for many centuries. Sometimes you can find like accounts from the Muslims themselves. This isn't just propaganda. It's Muslims bragging about just exterminating entire like Buddhist universities in India. Like the intrepidity of Muhammad al-Bakhtiar. He was keeping a chronicle. He eventually wound up getting killed, I think. So he eventually got some karma back at him. But there's this famous account of he sees this walled city, and so he and the Muslims just besiege. They just sort of attack this walled city. There's probably a few soldiers up on the walls trying to defend the place, and they break in, and then they just slaughter everybody. And it was all like they called them all bald, shaven-headed Brahmins, and it was like the Buddhist University of Odantapura that they sacked and just exterminated everybody. And they found all these books there. And Muhammad al-Bakhtiar wanted to know what the books were about, but they couldn't find anybody who could explain it to them because everybody had already been slaughtered. And you can read account after account after account of these Muslim conquerors just bragging about how they're just exterminating all idolatry, which is mainly Buddhism in India. So Theravada lucked out, or had good karma, in that it was centered at the time on the island of Sri Lanka, and the Muslims didn't have a navy, so they couldn't get to the island to exterminate Buddhism there. So it did spread more than Hinduism, at least internationally, and India was a predominantly Buddhist country for many centuries until it finally got exterminated. And before it was exterminated, it was kind of becoming degenerate, getting very tantric and esoteric and everything, so that it didn't have as firm a hold on the populace of India as it had before, because it was becoming so difficult to understand. You had so esoteric, you had to get initiated into these mysteries and so forth, that it was ready to get killed off anyways, I guess. So anyways, I'm just moving on to Nermit's next question, which is, what are your thoughts on Bhimrao Ambedkar and his adaptation of Buddhism? So I am exposed to some people who think that Sri Ambedkar was just kind of like a charlatan. Others think that Sri Ambedkar was just a modern day saint and sage. And I really don't know a whole heck of a lot about him. I do know that he tried to revive Buddhism in India, mainly for outcasts, for untouchables, or Harijans, or whatever they're called. People that didn't fit into the caste system, and so they were like untouchable. Excuse me. Like street sweepers and beggars and so forth. They really didn't have much of a chance. And so Ambedkar, Dr. Ambedkar, started this movement of converting them to Buddhism as a way of just getting them away from the tyranny of the caste system, or just the oppression, or just the disadvantage of being an untouchable in the Hindu caste system. They just sort of removed themselves from the whole system by converting to Buddhism. And it's clear to me, reading excerpts of Ambedkar's writings on Buddhism, that it seems to me it was mainly a social movement more than a spiritual one. That Ambedkar modified Buddhism to suit himself and his more secular views on the purpose of Buddhism in India. And so I really am more inclined. I don't think that he was a charlatan or a great sage. I do think he was kind of like a social reformer, that he was converting the untouchables to Buddhism, not so much out of a belief in Buddhism, but as a way of helping them socially by getting them out of Hinduism and the whole caste system that has them at the complete bottom. But he did kind of make free with his interpretation of Buddhist philosophy and change things to suit himself to some degree. But I'm no authority on Bhimrao Ambedkar. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Yugu. And Yugu says, how are you? I'm fine, thanks. Yugu's next question is, can you explain what was the reason why Buddha refused to ordain women? I know why, but why in particular? Why in all religion women are seen as inferior, particularly at that ancient times? Well, that's two questions, I think. I'm going to have to separate these. Okay, wait, I got to get rid of that space. Okay, so can I explain what was the reason why the Buddha refused to ordain women? The main reason why the Buddha refused to ordain women is because when you've got celibate men and celibate women interacting with each other, it is conducive to problems and scandals. So the Buddha did have to admit, according to the text, that women are just as capable of becoming enlightened as men are, but he didn't want a sangha of nuns just because, or like celibate men interacting with celibate women, it just causes problems. That celibate men should stay away from women. They should avoid women like the plague if at all possible. So that's the main reason. Just the likelihood of scandals arising in the Sangha, which is not good for the Sangha. It's not good for the reputation of the Sangha. So he just said, no, we're not going to do that at first. Then he got talked into it and then said, all right, but because I'm ordaining nuns now, the Sangha is only going to last for 500 years. Or the true teachings, the Saddhamma, will survive for only 500 years, which was about 2,000 years ago. So anyways, the next question from Yuga U, which was the second half of the second question, is why in all religion women are seen as inferior, particularly at that ancient times. Well, it's just like up until modern times, women were just pretty much generally seen as inferior to men just around the world. I mean, they could be respected and admired as mothers, as healers, as shamanesses, priestesses. You know, they'd have certain niches where they could shine. But as a general rule, like politically and socially, women were subject to men. Men were the leaders, and that was just might makes right, I suppose. Men were stronger than women, even though a lot of feminists would deny that. But men just generally are more powerful than women are, not due to some carefully structured patriarchy, but just because men are more aggressive and physically stronger, and they can just get what they want, I suppose, better than women can. So it's just sort of like an empirical observation in a certain sense. And then that social inferiority often resulted in certain biases where men just consider women to be even more inferior than just the empirical situation made them. Like, I think it was Aristotle considered women to be just practically, unteachable, that they were just so inferior. Aristotle even thought that they had as a sign of their inferiority, they didn't have as many teeth as men do, which isn't true. I guess that on average, women have slightly more teeth than men do, just because men might be more inclined to lose teeth. So, yeah, I mean, in all religions, women are seen as inferior up until, the 20th century, mainly just because women were like socially inferior and physically inferior. And so it was just sort of assumed that in general, women are inferior. And often like a patriarchal kind of religion will blame women for, the failures of men, like Eve talking Adam into eating the apple, for example. So, yeah, it's like the Hindus, I think, consider women to be like really the immoral gender. Throughout most of my life, I've kind of seen things the other way, but I think women have been more virtuous than men, largely just due to social pressure, which is now alleviated from them. And so they've just thrown off the burden and have become Instagram thoughts. So let's see here. I guess I answered that question in various indirect roundabout ways. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Xenothoid. And Xenothoid says, in the song Anesthesia by the band Type O Negative, there is a lyric which reads, "When you trust someone, illusion has begun. This made me wonder." So here's the actual question. Would the Buddha trust, not trust, trust and not trust, or neither trust nor not trust? It couldn't be distrust, because that is a necessary active state of mind. Trust seems like a passive state of mind, but perhaps that is only true from a samsaric conventional point of view. Neither trust nor not trust seems to be the correct answer, because it would mean having no view on the situation. Well, I mean, second guessing a fully enlightened Buddha is already, I mean, you're on thin ice already, trying to like second guess the motives of a fully enlightened being, a Sammasambuddha. I mean, it's kind of a fool's errand to begin with. But with regard to trusting people, the Buddha didn't have to trust or distrust because he could just look right through you. You know, he would know your mind. He would know if you were lying or telling the truth, if you were honest or dishonest. So, I mean, where would trust have to come in? Trust is based on ignorance. It's like giving someone the benefit of the doubt. But the Buddha didn't have to resort to giving the benefit of the doubt because he didn't have any doubts. I mean, he would just look right through you and know whether you were telling the truth or not. You know, he would know your thoughts better than you know your thoughts, I assume. So in a way, its trust would be totally irrelevant. But I mean, it wouldn't be mistrust. It would just be sort of an absence because it would just be inapplicable. It would be unnecessary. Why have belief if you already know? Belief and true knowledge are not the same. And trust is sort of like belief. But if you have the true knowledge of what the person is like, the trust is just misplaced. There's no room for it. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's second question, which is, you've mentioned, I'm going to make sure that we're actually recording here. Yeah, I guess we are. We've been going at it for an hour and a half. Ever since I had that recording software that kept glitching on me, I've become sensitized. Because there was one time I had to do the same Q&A 3 times because it would say that it was recording and then it wasn't. So bear with me. Anyways, Xenothoid says, you've mentioned that in the suttas there is a story of a dullard monk who became enlightened by rubbing a cloth. Do you believe stupid people can become enlightened? Yeah, that was pretty much the first question that I answered in this Q&A is along these same lines about any correlation between IQ and enlightenment. I do think that stupid people can become enlightened. Like Eckhart Tolle thinks worms and frogs are enlightened. So why not stupid people? That there really is a difference between intelligence and wisdom. So you can have an intelligent fool and a relatively stupid sage. A simple-minded sage, anyway. So I do think that it is possible. It might be, I mean, they may have certain handicaps in just like working out some of the basics, like the preliminary stuff. But then with regard to not having desires, I mean, the enlightenment is based on the Four Noble Truths. And it's like, if you don't have desires, then that's it. You're enlightened. If you're conscious and don't have desires, then presumably you're enlightened based on the third noble truth. And why would a stupid person have any more trouble eliminating desires than an intelligent person, unless their mind is kind of stupid to the point of like being defective, where they're not capable of really being mindful or some such. But yeah, I do think that it is definitely possible for someone with an IQ below 100 to become fully enlightened, if full enlightenment even exists in this world, which itself is a kind of problematic situation, or indeterminate or some such. So I'm just going to move on to Xenothoid's third question, which is, do you believe the Christian Trinity can make logical sense? From a Buddhist perspective, it would be absurd to ultimately say that there are any distinct entities, let alone 3, who are somehow different but also the same, even within the confines of conventional speech. I don't think it makes much sense. Yeah, well, I mean, the Aristotelian laws of thought would pretty much rule out there being 3 gods and also 1 God, because that's A equals not A. So yeah, I think the Catholics and some Protestant sects have really tried to make logical sense of the Christian Trinity, but I have read that the Greek Orthodox Christians actually play up the paradox. They play up the illogic as a way of humbling themselves, of just sort of rubbing their own noses in the fact that you cannot understand God intellectually. So that you have to let go of logic in order to just appreciate on faith that there's one God and three gods at the same time. So, yeah, I do think that you can't really make logical sense of it. I mean, you can try to rationalize it. You know, you've got the predetermined motive. You know, you've got what's the ulterior motive, or the predetermined outcome, where it's got to make sense. So we're going to do the best we can to rationalize this, how you can have God be one and three at the same time. But I do think that it may have started off as a deliberate flouting of logic, just as a way of transcending the limitations of the intellect, or sort of rejecting the intellect. I think it was Tertullian that was famous for saying, "It is impossible, therefore I believe it." You know, early Christianity was like that. And the Greek Orthodox Christians seem to have preserved that better than the more rationalistic Western schools of Christianity, like Catholicism and Protestant sects. So, yeah, it was like a deliberate illogic, like flaunting of illogic and flouting of logic. Flaunting and flouting are not the same word. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Romeo. And Romeo says, do you have any favorite artists, paintings, sculptures, or eras or styles, Western or otherwise? If so, what draws you to them? Well, let's see. I mean, some of the ancient Greek sculpture and the Roman, like, duplicates. I mean, it's good. I like that. Like the dying Gaul, stuff like that. The Renaissance, I mean, medieval art pretty much sucked because realism had been abandoned for religious reasons. You know, you weren't supposed to be focused on this worldly aspect of things. You're supposed to be focused more on a spiritual, otherworldly aspect. And so art kind of moved away from realism for 1,000 years. And then came back again with the Renaissance. And I mean, how can you do better than Renaissance masters? You know, that's one reason why modern art is deliberately ugly. I think it's largely sour grapes. They know they can't do any better than the Renaissance masters. So it's like, why even try? We'll just make ugly crap on purpose. Let's see. I like, what was it? Neoclassicism, like 1800s in, it'd be 1700s, early 1800s, like in English painting. They had more classical themes. I like in the Renaissance, lots of nice paintings, but somebody like Raphael, who was obviously a damn good painter, he was pretty much obsessed with Madonnas. He just cranked out one Madonna after the other. I think with regard to Renaissance, I preferred like the Dutch Renaissance, like Rembrandt and the Van Eycks, that kind of thing, where they were more into portraits and just sort of realistic scenes and kind of not so heavily focused on Madonnas and baby Jesuses and so forth. I like Velázquez. I liked his painting style. Let's see. Bouguereau, that's not the correct pronunciation of his name, but he was a good painter. I like looking at his paintings. For me, a good painting or a good sculpture is something that looks as much like real life as possible. You know, it's like I'm not much into Impressionism. I did not like much like Impressionism. I did not think that was really an improvement in painting. You know, Van Gogh, he's considered to be a great, but still I'd take Rembrandt any day of the week. Because I think, like, especially nowadays, now that photography has been invented and pretty much mastered, that a good painting or a good drawing should look as close to a photograph as possible. But in order not to make it just obsolete, that a good painting or drawing should be of something that you can't photograph. And so something like surrealism has always appealed to me. I've always liked surrealistic art. So of like the modern like painting fashions, I definitely prefer surrealism after the neoclassical phase of painting. What was it? Was it Daedalus? Or was it the son of Daedalus? Who was Icarus? Yeah, there was one painting I really liked of Icarus who crashed. His father made these wings. They escaped from prison, and then he flew too close to the sun. The wax that was holding the feathers onto the artificial wings started falling off, and then he crashes. And then there's this famous painting of Icarus kind of, looking sort of like a Greek god, like an Apollo or something, lying on the rock with these wings. And you got like these 3 naked nymphs, water nymphs, all coming up out of the water and gazing in wonder at this crashed Icarus. Paintings like that I like. Even if they don't have naked nymphs in them, I can still like them. So, yeah. I mean, he's mainly talking about painting and sculpture, so I'll leave out poetry, which would be another 5 or 10 minutes of me rambling. So, favorite artists. I mean, I do have kind of a tender spot in my heart for Escher. Although he belongs in his own category, really. And I guess I've named off a few, which is probably enough. I'm really not heavily into art. I've never really had the artistic temperament. I can draw fairly well, but again, it's more of reproduction of what I see. And I mean, I wasn't really artistically inspired since I was in high school, probably. When I was like an emo teenager, I was much more artistic than after I became like a cold-blooded scientist turned ascetic. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from 5 Precept Pete. And 5 Precept Pete says, is there any dharmic benefit to learning new skills like a language that enhance brain connectivity? Does developing the mind in this way indirectly deepen one's understanding of Dhamma? Well, there is the Mangala Sutta, which is the list of 38 blessings in life. I've mentioned it several times before, but usually with regard to blessing number 1, which is avoiding the company of fools. But one of the 38 blessings is being Bahusutta, which literally means having heard much. In other words, being learned with regard to a number of things. The Buddha says, even though you're a Buddhist, you should understand other philosophical positions just so that you'll be able to see, how they compare and contrast, how they are related, how best to defend Buddhism against the attacks of this other philosophy or whatever, if that necessity arises. So just being learned in general is considered to be a good thing in Buddhism. So knowing a lot of things is good, not just narrow-mindedly studying only Buddhist doctrine, which a lot of Western monks, they only want to read suttas and Vinaya. They only want to read Theravada Buddhist stuff, and they think reading Dostoevsky would be just an utter waste of time for a monk. But that's not necessarily the case. You can get insights into all sorts of things from non-Buddhist sources. You can get insights from watching an animal. You can get insights from reading the Bible or reading a novel by Dostoevsky, reading a poem by Walt Whitman that doesn't even rhyme. So there is that. With regard to like enhancing brain connectivity as an aid in Dhamma, that goes right back to the intelligence and versus wisdom kind of dichotomy that's been brought up a couple times already. That it can be helpful to have a stronger brain, like a more athletic kind of brain. It may be helpful in certain respects for insights to arise. You may be more intuitive that way just because you've got more nerve and you've got more branches to your neurons. And so you've got more possibilities, more possible routes for your insights to take maybe. It's not absolutely necessary, but it can be helpful. And I've always been kind of a brain jock. I like exercising my brain to some degree, just trying to solve evil Sudokus occasionally, that sort of thing. Even when I was a monk, I would like just brain exercises, just to keep my brain from getting flabby. So, have I answered the question? Is there any dharmic benefit to learning new skills like a language that enhance brain connectivity? I suppose so. And just dealing with practical matters. I mean, sometimes practical matters are helpful to a monk too. If you move to a foreign country, it's helpful to be able to speak the language of that country fluently. To learn Pali, for example, is good for a monk. Just to learn certain things that monks are supposed to learn. Just mastering philosophical concepts takes some intellectual exercise, that kind of thing. Remembering all the rules you have to follow takes a little bit of intellect. Comprehending stuff. So, I mean, I think it's possible for a stupid person to become enlightened, but I do think an intelligent person has certain advantages. Maybe statistically, his odds are a little better, although the odds for anyone are not particularly good for becoming enlightened. So, I guess I answered that question. I'm just going to move on to the next question, which is from the saboteurs. And the saboteurs say, what is the difference between ego and self-esteem? Well, the ego is like the conscious personality. Self-esteem would just be like one aspect of that. I think the ego technically is supposed to be like the interface between the conscious and unconscious minds, which contains, like your character as an individual. At least the conscious elements of that. But self-esteem would be just one strand of that. So ego would be a much broader term with regard to everything that it covers, and self-esteem would just be like one aspect of the ego. And I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Fred, who also goes by the name of Alfred. And Fred says, why is Nibbana unqualified? Well, Nibbana is not samsaric, and all qualifications are samsaric. Qualifications are limits, and Nibbana has no limits. So any qualification is going to apply only to samsara, and Nibbana is not there. Nibbana is off the scale of samsara. So qualifications can't touch it. Second question from Fred, is Nibbana worth aiming for? Well, obviously, if you're a Buddhist or even some other, like a Hindu, then Nibbana is certainly worth aiming for because it is the end of greed, hate, and delusion. Or, if you prefer, attraction, aversion, and semi-conscious stupidity. It is the end of suffering. It is the end of dukkha. So if you consider the end of dukkha, the end of suffering, or the end of delusion to be worth aiming for, then Nibbana is worth aiming for. But whether something is worth aiming for or not is a kind of value judgment, and different people are going to have their own value judgments. And some people would say, no, Nibbana is not worth aiming for because then I would die. I would cease to exist as an individual, and so I don't want that. But it's up to you. If you think that the end of delusion and suffering is worth aiming for, then go for it. And so I'm just going to move on to Fred's third question, which is the end goal is not explained, so why pursue it? Well, again, I mean, it's explained sort of as the end of delusion and suffering. And that in itself should be enough to inspire people to pursue it. That's what inspired the Buddha to pursue it. He didn't like this old age and sickness and death stuff. And so he wanted to transcend that according to tradition. And that's what inspired him to become like a religious mendicant, and what eventually caused him to become the Gautama Buddha, the Sammasambuddha of this era. So you can't really explain it because it's reality, and we're not dealing in reality. We're dealing with symbols that supposedly represent reality, but really don't. And so I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Austin. And Austin says, have you ever experienced remote viewing or had an out-of-body experience? Do you think monks are capable of such things? Well, I don't recall ever having like a really clairvoyant experience where I could see something that was beyond the limitations of my physical vision. The closest thing to that I've ever experienced would be some deja vu. I've had some striking deja vu experiences, including one deja vu that happened before the event happened. So I knew what was going to happen in advance. And I was just sitting there grinning like an ape because I knew what was going to be said next in the conversation. And somebody said it. And I saw that. I saw that before it happened. But with regard to out-of-body experience, the closest I ever had to an out-of-body experience, other than just like dreaming, that kind of thing, was drug-induced when I was a teenager. I took something that had belladonna in it, and I was having wild hallucinations, and I was also feeling very nauseous and sick and feeling like maybe I had just poisoned myself by taking strychnine or something. And so I lay down on my bed, and after a while, I felt like, well, I'm feeling a little better. Maybe I'll get up and make a peanut butter sandwich or something. I've told this story before. And I walk into the kitchen and I start making a peanut butter sandwich and then realize that I spread peanut butter on both slices of bread. And then that's kind of weird. And I'm just kind of looking around and everything. All of a sudden, poof, I'm lying on my back in bed again. So then I thought, well, did I really get up or was I just hallucinating that whole trip to the kitchen? And I was still rational enough to think, well, all I got to do is just go in and look at the counter and see if the bread is there. So I went out into the kitchen and the bread was there, but there was no peanut butter on it. So then I'm really starting to like carefully scrutinize everything. I'm like walking through the living room and looking at everything very carefully, trying to determine whether I'm really doing it or not. And then poof, I'm lying on my back in bed again. And I thought, well, this is just too much. I cannot trust what I am seeing. And so I just went to sleep. And the next morning there was no bread or anything. So it could have just been this really elaborate hallucination that seemed like an out-of-body experience, but probably was just a very elaborate hallucination. Because I was having very elaborate hallucinations even before that point. I was like 17 years old at the time. The only time I ever took belladonna derivative that I'm aware of. So I'm just going to move on to Austin's next question, which is, I know how dedicated you were as a monk living in that cave and everything. You mentioned that you could only progress so far and that it became exhausting trying to consistently maintain certain meditative states. While you were in Burma, did you meet anyone who seemed to be on a higher wavelength or more advanced than you? Or for the most part, did you find most monks there to be underwhelming? Well, I did meet a few old Seatos, and I've mentioned more than once that Shui Umin Seato may have been the one that I kind of got the feeling, like the intuition, that he was the most advanced monk that I ever really came across. With regard to other monks, it's not just one score. It's not like you have just one number that determines where you're at. Like, there have been lots of monks I have known that had lots more metta in their heart, more love in their heart than I do. I'm kind of a top-heavy person, relatively cold-blooded, and so possibly most monks, even like the ones that didn't meditate very much, might have been superior to me in certain regards, like just their love of their fellow man, that kind of a thing. So, and then you've got monks that would just be more patient than me, monks that didn't need to sleep as much as I do, monks that were less attached to food. You know, in certain respects, there are lots of individuals who are more advanced than me, but just because there isn't just one numerical score that you get for how advanced you are. So the number of monks that I met that in general, like if you had to lump everything together into one numerical score, it's hard to say. Shui Umin Seato, I mean, obviously he was one, but sometimes you meet like this old Seato living in a cemetery. He seems very serene and benevolent and everything, but you don't really know a person until you've gotten to really know them and see them at their worst. And just because a person seems very content and calm and benevolent and so forth. I mean, he's talking to a visitor he's never met before. It may be that he's just on his best behavior. But I've met quite a few monks that I assumed were very wise. But it's hard to say exactly. But I have no doubt that I met lots of monks and lay people that were more advanced than I was in certain ways, like with regard to the amount of metta that they have towards others. Especially, I mean, I've been working on it for decades now, but when I was a younger man, I really had very little love for the human race. I preferred the company of trees and animals to the company of humans, as a general rule. It's only in my later years that I've softened towards humanity. So, see, at the bottom here, he says, or for the most part, did you find most monks there to be underwhelming? Yeah, most monks, like most Asian monks especially, they just have this medieval dogmatic approach. They're uninspired. They don't really have a spiritual calling. They have other motives for becoming a monk. It's just their family was poor villagers with 8 kids. They had too many mouths to feed, so they just send one of their kids to the monastery. Or some monks are just sort of latent homosexuals, and they want a socially acceptable way of not getting married to a woman. So they just become celibate monks and usually set themselves up in a relatively luxurious monastery in town. Like almost every Mahasi center in Burma has like the resident latent homosexual Sayadaw. Not necessarily the abbot, but he'll be like an assistant abbot. So, yeah, there are a few monks that were considered to be very saintly and sage-like. Mahamnyain Uzodika was another. He was a better meditator than I was, apparently. A lot of people were impressed by how wise he was. But, probably in some respects, I would still be more advanced than him, but in most respects, he would probably be more advanced than I was back when I knew him. So, yeah, it's kind of complex. There's all these different factors that have to be taken into consideration. But as a general rule, Asian monks from a Buddhist culture that are just following along with the mainstream of their culture by becoming monks, most of them really aren't even trying to cultivate wisdom other than just in a token manner as a way of earning merit or just because they have to sit in meditation due to the rules at their monastery or something. They'll willingly go along with that, but they're just really not inspired and motivated with a genuine vocation, like a spiritual calling. Most Asian monks in an Asian Buddhist culture, they just don't have it. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Quaesitor. So Quaesitor says, if sight, sound, touch, smell, taste, and mental formations are absent, body is completely absent, and all that remains is the experience of awareness, contentment, bliss, and stillness, and an inner monologue commenting on the experience, would this still be considered a self having a subjective experience, or do the khandhas need to be present? Well, obviously, if there's any kind of experience, the khandhas have to be present. Consciousness is one of the 5 khandhas, Vijnana Khandha. And like this inner monologue, obviously that's thoughts, that's perceptions. So, all of this really is the five khandhas. It's still there, except for he says there's no body, but all that remains is the experience of awareness, which would be consciousness, I guess. Contentment. Contentment with what? What contentment? I'm not exactly sure what he even means by that. You'd think that contentment would be a kind of feeling. Bliss, which also is, sometimes like Satchitananda in Hinduism, the highest reality is considered to be bliss. So it's hard to say with regard to that one. Stillness and an inner monologue. How are you going to have an inner monologue and stillness at the same time? Yeah, the inner monologue just can't happen without 5 khandhas. Would this be considered a self? I mean, without perceiving it, it's like there's nothing there. It is, I mean, I gotta take a drink. A big drink. So this is kind of a strange question. I mean, would this be considered a self? I mean, in Buddhism, nothing is considered a self, except for a deluded mind. A deluded mind considers selves to exist, according to early Buddhist philosophy. Only a deluded mind would consider a self to exist. So, would this be considered a self? Well, to a deluded mind it would, but I mean, only to a deluded mind you'd even be the awareness of contentment. I mean, it depends on how subtle you think contentment and bliss can go. If you think that contentment and bliss can just merge with ultimate reality, like the Hindu conception of Satchitananda, which is like true mental bliss, which is like practically a synonym for Brahman or ultimate reality or God, then maybe you could have that, but it wouldn't be reified, and so you wouldn't say that it exists. Once you start saying that it exists, then you're dealing with perceptions and delusion, and then it's all just samsaric delusion. So, would this still be considered a self having a subjective experience? I don't think there would be a subjective experience. I really don't. There would be no subject. You can't have a subject unless you're contrasting it with an object, and there's no object. So there's no subject either. So in order to have the belief in a self or the perception of a self, obviously the khandhas have to be present, because perception is one of the khandhas. Consciousness also is one of the khandhas. So I'm just going to move on to Quaesitor's second question, which is the belief that Buddhism is the only path to liberation based on the direct experience of Nibbana at the stage of Sotapanna, resulting in the understanding of the Four Noble Truths and obtaining right view, since Nibbana is outside of the scope of samsara, and the Sotapanna would then know that there is an end to suffering and how to attain it? Well, again, I consider the whole 4 stages of Aryahood to be a later artifact and probably not the authentic, genuine teachings of Buddhism or of Buddha. And so, I mean, that whole argument of Sotapannas getting their glimpse of Nibbana and all that is kind of academic. But that is just kind of irrelevant, because I can answer the question regardless of the 4 stages of sainthood, because he says, is the belief that Buddhism is the only path to liberation based on the direct experience of Nibbana? No. The belief that Buddhism is the only path to liberation is based on the universal human phenomenon of people believing that their religion is the only true one. So, the belief that Christianity is the only path to liberation is based on Christians just preferring to believe that their religion is the one true religion. The belief that Islam is the only path to liberation is based on the human belief of Muslims that their religion is the only true religion. And the belief that Buddhism is the only path to liberation is based on the human phenomenon of people believing that their religion is the only true religion. Period. So, I'm just going to move on to Quaesitor's third question, which is, what separates 2 meditators who experience fourth jhana on a regular basis, that one can become liberated by letting go of the desire for liberation, whereas the other cannot? Perhaps the one with the potential for liberation experientially knows that there is a higher state, and the other doesn't, or perhaps it's more of a letting go of the idea of cultivating subtler states of mind. Well, you got 2 meditators who say have mastered fourth jhana. The difference between the one who becomes enlightened and the one who doesn't become enlightened is the one who becomes enlightened has some kind of liberating insight. So the difference would be one of them would be more insightful than the other, maybe a little more inspired than the other, maybe a little more outside the box than the other. You know, he's something inside him. He's got the spiritual talent of still not clinging to samsara as much as the one who doesn't become liberated. So both of them experience what originally probably was considered to be the highest possible stage of meditation. One becomes enlightened because that highest possible stage of meditation somehow triggered a liberating insight. And it's not even necessarily the same insight that everyone experiences. Whereas the other person who doesn't become enlightened doesn't have that insight. And it's just one of them is more insightful. One is more just less attached in their usual samsaric frame of mind when they're not meditating, that sort of thing. So it's just going to be a matter of talent, I think. And plus maybe other factors that's very subtle. But I think the main differentiation would just be one person is more intuitive and insightful and has more spiritual talent, maybe a little more inherent wisdom than the other one. Plus maybe there's a certain like karmic momentum that's helping them, that's not helping the other person, that sort of thing. The other person might just not be ripe yet, just not ready for it yet. So I'm just going to move on to this question, which is from Arpad. And Arpad says, how often is a monk allowed to shower, bathe, or wash himself in any fashion? Is soap allowed, or is it considered a cosmetic? Well, I guess that's two questions, isn't it? I count questions by the number of question marks. So the first question is, how often is a monk allowed to shower, bathe, or wash himself in any fashion? Well, if you read the Patimokkha rules, there is a Pachitya rule saying that a monk is only allowed to bathe no more than once every 2 weeks, unless there are certain factors, like it's like towards the end of the hot season, which is very muggy and sweaty. It's the beginning part of the rainy season, which is similar. If the monk has been traveling, if the monk has been sick, if there has been like a storm with wind and rain, which kind of gets mud everywhere, then a monk is allowed to bathe more than once every 2 weeks. But unless any of those special allowances, unless they are there, the monk is only allowed to bathe once every 2 weeks. But it's pretty obvious that even in ancient times, before the Tipitaka was finalized, there were a lot of monks who didn't like that rule. So there is a scene in the Vinaya of a monk from southern India, or at least south of the Ganges Valley, sort of on the frontier of Buddhism at the time, who comes back and talks to the Buddha. I think it was Sona Kurikana, who also recites the Atthakavagga in the same narrative. But his teacher asked him to ask the Buddha if certain rules could be changed. And one of those rules was the rule that you can't bathe more than once every 2 weeks, because supposedly, according to the narrative, the Indian people south of the Ganges Valley were more fastidious with regard to bathing regularly and cleanliness, and they would look down on monks that were dirty and stinky. And so the Buddha, according to the narrative, modified that rule, even though it stays the same as it is in the Patimokkha, that you're only allowed to bathe no more than once every 2 weeks, unless those special events, end of the hot season, beginning of the rainy season, sickness, travel, storm, unless that happens, no more than 2 weeks. But then in Vinaya, in a different area of Vinaya, it says, well, that only applies to the Ganges Valley, the Majjhima Desa, the central area of Buddhism, which is the Ganges Valley. That outside of the Ganges Valley, which includes Burma, Thailand, Sri Lanka, the United States, Europe, Australia, etc., everything outside of the Ganges Valley of India, you can bathe as much as you want. So monks can bathe every day, which I usually did, especially when the weather was hot, because I'd be drenched in sweat all day anyway. And so it's good to at least rinse off the old layer of sweat to make room for the new layer of sweat. So I answered that rule, I suppose. And so I'll just answer that question, I should say. And so I'll just move on to Arpad's second question, which is soap allowed or is it considered a cosmetic? In the Buddhist time, soap hadn't been invented yet. They used something else. It was made out of, it was like powdered limestone mixed with water or something. It was kind of a soap-like substance that was used. And it is allowed, although you're not supposed to use perfumes. So when I was in Burma, I used this stuff called carbolic soap that had had carbolic acid in it, and it had this strong, unpleasant chemically smell, which I considered to be okay because monks aren't supposed to use perfumes. Most soap is perfumed. And so I just used this cheap kind of soap. Sometimes I just used lye soap that you're supposed to use for washing clothes. I'd use that if I didn't have any of the stinky carbolic stuff. So soap isn't considered to be a cosmetic, but the nice scents that are infused into the soap are considered to be perfume, which monks are supposed to avoid if at all possible. And so I'm just going to move on to Arpad's third question. Does rebirth occur in plants and minerals? And I think that Jains would say that plants and maybe minerals are subject to like rebirth. With regard to Buddhism, it's not so clear. I don't recall ever coming across any statement unequivocally just declaring that plants and or minerals are reborn, like crystals, something like that, are subject to rebirth. In Vinaya, it does say that plants are what are called ekindriya jiva, which is one faculty life. So apparently they have consciousness, and also they have the sensation of touch, and that's all they've got. They've got consciousness and one sense faculty of touch. They don't see, hear, smell, think, but they do have touch. And so that could be considered a primitive form of sentience that may possibly be subject to rebirth, but I don't recall any clear, unequivocal statement in the texts stating that yes, indeed, plants do get reborn. So that's sort of like a borderline case that I don't think Buddhist philosophy, at least in Theravada, in the Tipitaka, ever really nailed down and tried to answer like unequivocally. With regard to my own idea, minerals, I don't think that they would be reborn. You have to have consciousness, and not only consciousness, but you would have to have karma in order to be reborn, which would mean you have to have will. You have to have like motives for your actions. And minerals don't have that, I'm pretty sure. And maybe that someday silicon chips might have that, but I don't think they have it yet. And with regard to plants, I mean, it would be at such a subliminal, like elementary, archaic, primeval kind of level that maybe, but it would be sort of a borderline case, I think. Because, I mean, if they don't have, I'm kind of doubtful. In fact, I'm doubtful even of certain primitive animals that you'd have to have karma in order to be reborn. Whether they're conscious or not is irrelevant. I think that the entire universe may be pervaded with consciousness. That, a can of Red Bull with a white and blue label or a gold label in Thailand or Asia, I mean, it's pervaded by consciousness, but you could say it's a manifestation of consciousness, but it's not really thinking. It's not really making karma. So in a way, it's kind of enlightened. So maybe plants would be considered enlightened. I think some Zen masters have declared that trees are enlightened. But with regard to minerals, I think not. But with regard to plants, if they do have rebirth, it would be at a very, very primitive elementary stage where they have just the most primitive elementary kind of will. Maybe something like in a Schopenhauerian sense, where everything has this will, which would be like karma, that is just seeking manifestation in the world. So in a case like that, plants maybe, but I'm pretty sure that Orthodox Theravada, at least in the earlier texts, I can't really say about commentarial tradition or sub-commentarial tradition, anything like that, but in the earliest texts, I don't think that there's any statement one way or the other about plants being reborn. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Trumptonshire Gahapati. And Trumptonshire Gahapati says, if AI takes over the world and kills all humans, would that be evidence tending to disprove Dharma? And I don't see how it would disprove Dharma. I mean, how would it possibly disprove Dharma? I mean, especially the Four Noble Truths. I mean, regardless of whether AI kills us or not, that, I mean, desire is still the cause of all suffering. The cessation of desire is the cessation of suffering. And, you know, the Noble Eightfold Path is the path that is conducive to the cessation of suffering. I mean, that would all stay true. So I don't think that Dharma would be disproven by the technological singularity, assuming that the technological singularity happens and it doesn't turn out well for us humans. So I'll just move on to Trumptonshire Gahapati's next question, which is, how about if AI takes over the world and creates a paradise on Earth for humans? It seems like either of those scenarios would be a major problem for the Abrahamic religions, but still, I don't see how, whether if AI like destroyed us, poofed us out of existence, or whether it just became like this enlightened servant and turned Earth into a paradise, I don't see how that would disprove Dharma either way. Because again, the Four Noble Truths stay true. And I mean, it's going to be in accordance with our karma, whatever happens. So I don't see that there would be any hazard to the veracity or the believability of Dharma, regardless of what AI does or doesn't do. It seems pretty straightforward to me. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from Rui. And Rui says, do you think the verbal and intellectual inaccessibility of Nibbana could make it an object of anxiety? Sure. Yeah, definitely it is. I mean, it is certainly an object of anxiety to some people, because it's just this nebulous something that you can't grasp, you can't understand it. And when people identify with their understanding, something you don't understand can be scary. I mean, it's like death. I mean, some people that meditate, they get to the level of such subtlety that they can't really feel their ego anymore. They can just start to panic and just bail out of the meditation because it's scary, because, you know, they're getting too deep and they want to cling to this identity that's starting to dissolve, and it's scary. It's like they're dying. So certainly, I mean, I've said before that if somehow somebody invented an enlightenment pill where you took the pill, probably a red one, and it causes you to become enlightened, that even a lot of monks, maybe most monks, would run from that pill as though it were a rabid demon-possessed snake, because most people are enlightened, not because we're not trying hard enough, but because we want to be enlightened. That's why we're here. So certainly, just Nibbana itself, partly because it's so nebulous and ununderstandable, that it's just an object of anxiety or even fear. So I'm just going to move on to Rui's next question, which is, over-focusing on Nibbana distracts from the path, does it not? Certainly, especially when you get towards the end of the path. Towards the beginning, it might be the main motivator that helps you to stay on the path, is focusing on the goal. But eventually, you have to let go even of that attachment or that desire. And I've got a dog looking at me now. Hey, dude. So let's see. Yeah, I mean, we've gone over this a number of times, I think, where, I mean, focusing on the goal is useful at first. You know, it's like, again, knocking out the big peg with the smaller peg, but eventually you have to get rid of all the pegs. You know, it's focusing on nibbana as part of the raft that once you cross the flood, you don't need it anymore. And I mean, it just becomes, at first it's skillful means, and then as you progress and get closer and closer to the goal, then any kind of attachment or desire is eventually you're gonna have to let everything go. So I'm just gonna move on to the next question. This is from Cleefy. And Cleefy says, are we too late to stop the Islamization of Europe? And I mean, that depends on what direction Europe takes over the next 10, 20 years. Like, if it continues stubbornly to go the globalist route, then maybe so. Then maybe it's too late and Europe is going to become Islamized, at least Western Europe and parts of Central Europe. Eastern Europe, I think, will resist Islamization. On the other hand, if like the nationalism that is becoming more and more in fashion, like as is exemplified by the re-election of Donald Trump, then it may be that there's going to be a reconquista before the Muslims conquer, that they'll just be driven out or whatever, forced to assimilate, like early non-Muslims were forced to assimilate to Islam. But even, let's say, Western and Central Europe does get turned into like a caliphate, then still, I mean, they're 100, 200, 300 years later, there could still be another reconquista. I mean, Spain was almost entirely ruled by Muslims for a few centuries anyway. And then eventually you had some badasses in northern Spain, started fighting back successfully, and the Muslims eventually got driven out, and that could happen in Europe too. So we're just going to have to wait and see. I don't think it's necessarily too late to stop the Islamization of Europe, because anything is possible. We're just going to have to wait and see. And it may be that if the Europeans have become so demoralized and culturally castrated that they're just going to bow their heads and just get conquered without putting up a fight for fear of being racist, then yeah, they're going to get what they deserve. Fortunately, America is more invaded by relatively innocuous Hispanics who, for the most part, are willing to work for a living instead of hanging out on street corners harassing Western women. So, yeah, we're just going to have to wait and see what direction Europe takes over the next few years. See if AfD actually comes to power in Germany. Then that could be a game changer right there. Or see if somehow nationalists can topple the uniparty in the UK. So, I guess I'll just move on to the next question, which is from Wayne. And Wayne says, near-death experiences tell us that near-death experiencers, I suppose, tell us that they feel way more aware and alive when they leave their bodies, and whatever they think shows up instantly. One case study, a lady thought of her sister 5,000 miles away, and she was in her home instantly. She observed she couldn't find her grocery list and was trying to tell her it was by the phone. She also seen what she was wearing and the other finer details she observed while she was there. Later, when she was revived, her sister confirmed that what she had told her was all true. This seems to be a common experience among all NDEs. My question is, there must be mind, spirit, or consciousness that is always present and aware, and that we must take control of. Who is this I that experiences and thinks if it is not the self? Well, again, if you want to assume that there really are phenomena in this universe. Going with like Theravada Buddhism, which admits, allows that there are actually entities that really exist. Still, what we consider to be like a person's self is like a flame. It's different from one moment to the next. There is no unifying essence that pervades that flame that makes it into like this unified entity. It's just that there's conditions for that flame. Like any Boy Scout can tell you, if you've got heat, oxygen, and fuel, you're going to have flame. But when that heat, oxygen, and fuel are no longer there, like at least one of those three is an insufficient supply, then the flame ceases. It's not like the flame goes anywhere. And it wasn't the same flame from one moment to the next, and there wasn't even this unifying flameness holding it all together. It's just these phenomena in flux, changing from one moment to the next due to conditions allowing their existence. And in a human mind, somehow this flame-like conglomeration of mental states becomes self-referential. It's still changing from one moment to the next, although there's a lot of similarity because of momentum. And it starts thinking that it's this unified I, which it is not. So let's see. My question is, there must be a mind, spirit, or consciousness that is always present and aware, although it's not the same from one moment to the next. And that we must take control of, but no, we don't have control. We have maybe limited control, but like the Buddha's second discourse after his enlightenment, the Anatta-Lakkhana Sutta says, with regard to any of the five khandhas, you cannot say, let it be this way, let it not be that way, and reliably have it happen. We do not have that kind of control over anything. So who is this I that experiences and thinks if it is not the self? It is delusion. And if you want to take it even farther, like some Mahayana schools, I mean, even these little particulate entities that are in constant flux from moment to the next, like in a flame, even those are not ultimately real. That the existence of any kind of entity separate from anything else is based on delusion, because ultimately there is no separateness. With regard to near-death experiences, yeah, I suppose in some cases they can be more vivid. It's like sort of like the Bardo realm. It's almost like you're in a temporary Deva realm where you have certain Deva powers, like being able to like see what's going on 1,000 miles away, or just suddenly teleport there, know the minds of others, have like clairvoyance, this kind of thing. That it could be that some people, after they die or when they're in like a near-death experience kind of a situation, that they're actually going into like a higher realm. Not necessarily, not everybody's going to do that, but some people will kind of go into a higher realm and have like Deva-like abilities, whereas other people, they may be going into a lower realm. But not all near-death experiences are exactly the same. He says somewhere here, let's see, this seems to be a common experience among all near-death experiences. Now, it's not all of them. I mean, they do have certain similarities where, you rise up above your body and you go into the bright light and you wind up in some realm with usually a kind of spirit guide who, tells you things that you need to know. And then maybe you're told that you have to go back, or maybe you're given a choice on whether you want to stay or go back, that kind of a thing. And then you wind up back in the body that's damaged somehow. But yeah, the heightened state of consciousness with the clairvoyant powers, I don't know if that is common to all near-death experiences, although it's common to some of them anyway. But, I mean, it's certainly no proof of the reality of a self. Excuse me. Need another drink of my emergency backup beverage, which is almost exhausted at this point. Okay. Next question is from Apocalypse Chow, who I suspect is the same person as Skoladin or Skuladin because he's got the same kind of bullet points after his questions. So Apocalypse Chow says, would you kindly explain the role of the Trinity? So 2 Trinity questions in one Q&A. That's kind of unusual. He says, let's see, I've seen it pop up in various places. Maharaji had a chapter in his book with that theme. Carl Jung mentioned it while describing the triple goddess metaphor. It was even used as a plot device in an edgy Christian-themed apocalyptic giant robot show from the 90s. And of course, it's in martial arts, mind, essence, and karma, or ki. My best guess is that the Trinity is a general formula tailored to the culture it derives, and the goal is a higher mental state or mental maturity, but it's kind of like Maharaji's teachings, which weren't one size fits all. So anyways, getting back up to the actual question, would you kindly explain the role of the Trinity? And he seems to have, he seems not to be referring particularly to the Christian Trinity of, God, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. That would be the Christian Trinity. God, the Father, God, the Son, God, the Holy Spirit. So they're all God, but there's 3 and also just 1, which we've already discussed earlier in this Q&A. I do think that this 3-ness, 3 is a magic number, that 3 is common in a lot of spirituality, not so much maybe in Theravada Buddhism. There are groups of 3. You got Mara's 3 daughters. You got the 3 poisons, greed, hate, and delusion, that sort of thing. But it's not as central to Buddhist philosophy as in other spiritual traditions. But I think spirituality having prominent 3s, like in Mahayana, you've got the Trikaya. I guess even in Theravada, the scriptures are divided into 3 baskets, although the 3rd basket is like a later artifact. First you had Dhamma Vinaya, and then Abhidhamma got added, like probably at the 3rd council. So yeah, you got the Trinity of gods in Hinduism. You got the 3 bodies in Mahayana Buddhism. You got obviously the Trinity in Christianity. I'm not sure what the equivalent in like Judaism or Islam would be, but I wouldn't be surprised if they've got some prominent triad in their systems also. But I think it's just like a triangle is a stable figure. It's just like in architecture, it is stable. Like a square can collapse on itself, but a triangle is stable. That's why a geodesic dome is generally made out of triangles, because they're very stable and secure. And maybe that idea of something with 3 parts just kind of fitting together into this indestructible, unity, it somehow permeated into philosophical thought and religious thought. But I'm really not sure why the number 3 is so prominent, other than that it's just a low number that's going to come up a lot anyway. So yeah, it's the role of the Trinity differs in different Trinities. The role of the Trinity in Christianity, even that's hard enough to explain because it's not particularly logical anyway. So the role of the Trinity, I assume in different religions, different Trinities are going to have different roles. But it could just be like 3 different levels of reality that somehow form like this stable, like kind of interlocking whole, this unity that somehow is emotionally satisfying to philosophical, ancient religious people. And so I guess I'm just going to move on to the next question from Apocalypse Chow, who I think is alias Skoladin. And his question is, Hegelian dialectics seem anti-spiritual, like the people affected by it get slammed in the opposite direction. On a spectrum of mental states where humanity is middle of the road, it would be leans left towards animal-mindedness, heedless, mindless NPC, or maybe it's the political class, ruling class, that gets elevated by bringing others down like a zero-sum game. And then the bullet point is Hegelian dialectics purpose to promote psychopaths all the way to the top by creating sociopaths? No, I don't think that's the purpose of Hegelian dialectics. I really don't. I've really never noticed like Hegelian philosophy tending towards animalistic mental states. Marxism is partly based on like the Marxist dialectic is based on the Hegelian dialectic, although of course Marx rejected idealism and just preferred materialism, which is more animalistic. Materialism, I suspect, is more animalistic than idealism, the idea that it's all just mental states. F.H. Bradley, who is one of my favorite Western philosophers, was heavily influenced by Hegel. He was an idealist, and I mean, he certainly was not particularly animalistic. Although there is a legend that F.H. Bradley, who lived at Oxford, used to have as a habit, he'd go up and sit on a roof or something like that, or just he had like this little veranda or something outside of his room, and he'd shoot stray cats with a pistol from there, which is kind of animalistic. But as a general rule, I just don't see like Hegelian dialectics pushing people towards animalistic mental states or towards psychopathy. Although I guess shooting at cats for fun is kind of sociopathic. So, yeah, I think Hegelian dialectics just got like hijacked. First by Marx and then later by like latter day neo-Marxists. It's just sort of like the teachings of Jesus have been hijacked by a lot of weird, like the Inquisition, for example. So Hegelian dialectics, the purpose of Hegelian dialectics is supposedly to arrive at some higher truth through logical necessity, but it really fails in that endeavor. So I do not think its purpose is to promote psychopaths all the way to the top by creating sociopaths. I just do not see that. I don't think that Hegel himself was a sociopath. He may have been. I haven't really studied up on him all that much, but it just seems that he was just kind of like a civilized, gentlemanly, milquetoasty kind of a guy. So, yeah, my guess would be that Hegelian dialectics, largely due to somebody like Karl Marx admiring the system, which was kind of a charlatan-y kind of a system, in my opinion. I agree with Schopenhauer on that score. It just got hijacked and converted over into a system that has been, it has wound up creating possibly more evil than good. But I think it was just sort of a matter of happenstance and not any like deliberate evil on the part of Hegel. So I'm just going to move on to Apocalypse Chow's third question, which is woke an iteration or trope of romance fiction? And then he's got the bullet points. I noticed that both have many similarities in common. Same demographics, lonely woman and extremely feminine men, core demo middle-aged women with arrested development and massive amounts of alone time. Encyclopedia Britannica's article on romance fiction notes that to romance has come to mean to make up a story that has no connection with reality. Good Samaritans often point out that the woke make up stories with no basis in reality, like Jussie Smollett, The reader of romance is not primarily concerned with the reason of why things happen the way they do. Romance writers will elucidate or elaborate material by scrutinizing or debating actions, motives, and states of mind. Woke writers will further an agenda by scrutinizing or debating actions, motives, and states of mind. Apparently, while white privilege is a mental state, so they don't consider Clarence Thomas black, LOL. And the last bullet point says, both, if taken seriously as the world as it's supposed to be, and end in severe sexual frustration and extreme outcomes, crazy cat ladies abusing animals, and school shooters. So after all these strange bullet points, we wind up back at the actual question, is woke an iteration or trope of romance fiction? And I really don't think so. Romance fiction, I mean, romance originally comes from like the Middle Ages, and it meant originally a romance was any kind of writing in a vernacular language and not Latin. Like in the Middle Ages, like scholarly works, like religious texts and so forth, were generally composed in Latin, like medical texts, Latin. And so a romance was something that for some reason was written in the vernacular of the country, like French, for example, and not in Latin. And then later on, romance became like poetry written not in Latin, mainly about chivalry. And that, I assume, is how romance in modern English usage came to mean like men and women falling in love with each other, and sort of idealistic descriptions of that in literary form. Because it started at one point, a romance was a tale of like courtly love, like some knight and his lady that he adores and maybe is married to some other guy and that sort of thing. He fights duels for her honor and all that. And then that came to morph into like the stereotypical Harlequin romance or those Hallmark movies or whatever. But woke, I mean, you can come up with similarities between all sorts of things. I mean, you can come up with probably more similarities between woke and early Christianity in the Roman Empire. Like neo-Marxism now, political correctness, progressivism, whatever you want to call it. It's sort of like our version of late Roman Christianity, except late Roman Christianity, to be fair, did have some kind of moral high ground, which progressivism does not. Progressivism mainly just takes unrefined feminine sentiment and identifies that as morals. And certain things just completely are disregarded as within the realm of morals, like any kind of sensual overindulgence, no longer a moral issue. So is woke an iteration or trope of romance fiction? I really do not think so. I've never, when I have done any kind of research into like the origins of neo-Marxism, you know, it goes back to people like the Frankfurt School and what they were trying to do. And it has no mention at all of romance fiction. So if they have many similarities in common, that's just coincidental, I'm pretty sure. And it's not even necessarily the same demographics anymore. Unless the demographics are the readers, which would be like bored upper class white women, I suppose. So yeah, I really do not think that woke is an iteration or trope of romance fiction. I just think that it's just sort of a feminized version of Marxism with changes made, like getting away from class and just considering the patriarchy to be the oppressive class, that kind of thing. So woke is sort of anti-male, whereas romance fiction is really not anti-male. I don't even think that extremely feminine men I mean, they're not the stars of romance fiction. It's usually some rugged masculine man is like the star male. He's like the love interest in romance fiction. So I guess when he says that lonely women and extremely feminine men, I mean, Skoladin, I mean, Apocalypse Chow, is referring to the people who read these novels. And I've never heard of any man preferring to read romance novels. I think I've read one romance novel, which was Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, just because somebody sent it to me when I was living in a cave in Burma. And when you're living in a cave in Burma and you've got a limited number of books, you pretty much read everything you've got. And Jane Austen was definitely a good author. She wrote good, even though it's the kind of stuff that I'm really not particularly interested in. So anyways, I hope I answered that question, because I'm moving on to the next question. This is from Joe Doe. And Joe Doe says, my brother seems to think babies are enlightened. I think they know nothing. Thoughts? Just a minute. You gotta stop it. The dogs are acting up. So, Joe Doe says, my brother seems to think babies are enlightened. I think they know nothing. Thoughts? There is a sutta in the Pali Tipitaka discussing this very idea that babies are enlightened, and Buddhism says no, babies are not enlightened, that really they've got all these karmic underlying tendencies that are just keeping them unenlightened, and they have no way of working them off yet because they haven't really developed enough intelligence or maturity to really start working out their karma very well in this life. I mean, karma has happened. I mean, they have karmic fruition by stuff happening to them, and they're maybe making new karma, but they can't really get any kind of liberating insight. They're not really enlightened. I mean, how can you call someone enlightened when their primary method of communication is screaming? I mean, how can you consider babies to be enlightened? Mainly, I mean, they might have minimal delusion. You might have less delusion than the average adult, but a cow has less delusion than the average adult. And I don't know of many people other than maybe Eckhart Tolle who think cows are enlightened. Maybe some Hindus do. But the thing is, from a Buddhist point of view, these babies have lots of underlying tendencies, karmic stuff that they're still subject to, and they're making more karma because of delusion, because they really don't know very much yet. So, yeah, there's some people might think that babies are enlightened the way they would think that animals are enlightened, non-human animals, I mean. But really, from a Buddhist point of view, neither is anywhere near to being enlightened. And that babies, they have these unenlightened underlying tendencies that haven't been able to manifest yet because the baby's not grown enough for them to start manifesting. So I'm just going to move on to the next question. This is from PSA, and by golly, it's the last question. Boom! It always takes me by surprise. And hell, we're less than 3 hours. So this is doing pretty good. I was hoping this would be less than 3.5 because we had about 50 questions to answer in this Q&A. So anyways, this last question is from PSA. And PSA says, I heard monks are not allowed to wear any form of underwear. That sounds really uncomfortable. Is it negotiable, or is it a big sin for a monk to wear boxers under his robes? And I do not understand why freeballing it with a kind of sarong would be uncomfortable. I mean, I don't get that at all. The only time I was uncomfortable wearing a lower robe with no underpants was right after I had dyed that robe. And if you dye a robe, especially with certain substances, then it can get super stiff. It's like cardboard, and it can get rough. Because I would wear like a lower robe made out of essentially canvas because they would last longer that way. I wouldn't have to make a new robe every year. That if you make your lower robe out of a kind of homespun, like rough homespun or canvas, it would last at least 2 years, which cuts the amount of robes you have to sew in half. And so you dye the robe so that it's stiff like cardboard, and you'd have to like force it to fold it around yourself, and then it would be rough enough that you could get some abrasion going. But just, I mean, I have no idea, no clue whatsoever about how freeballing it under a comfy cotton sarong could be the least bit uncomfortable. Maybe some guys are just too dangly or something and will sit on it, but I mean, it's like something you get used to. You learn how to deal with it. It's the way people are, men in particular, are naturally designed. I mean, we are evolved to go around freeballing it. So it's not really uncomfortable. I have no clue why PSA would think that it would be uncomfortable. So then he gets to this part. Is it negotiable, or is it a big sin, which is not a Buddhist concept, for a monk to wear boxers under his robes? It's against the rules of monastic discipline. I mean, a monk is only allowed to wear 3 robes: an upper robe, an outer robe, and a lower robe. That's it. You're not allowed to wear layman's clothing, which includes shirts and, stocking caps and socks and all these other things that Western monks and Eastern monks will wear in the temperate zone, sometimes even in the tropics. I've gone to the tropics and seen a monk, in a tropical country. It'd be during the cold season, but still, it's not going to get very cold. It's certainly not going to get anywhere down close to freezing. And they've got like stocking caps and socks and this sort of thing on. And it's just against the rules. And monks would prefer to break the rules than do something like wrap themselves up in a wool felt blanket, which is actually allowable. So, yeah, for a monk to wear boxers under his robes, first of all, it's just silly and unnecessary. And it's just like this womanly desire for comfort, I guess, to be cozy. But also for a monk to wear anything besides the 3 robes, the 3 regulation robes, is against the rules. And he's certainly not allowed to wear layman's clothing, which would include layman's underwear or layman's socks. But it's a minor offense. It's a dukkha offense, which is the lowest category of offense. You just make confession and you are absolved of that offense. But if you just keep wearing them, if you're wearing the underwear while you're making the confession, you've immediately broken the rule again as soon as you've stopped making the confession. So, yeah, I guess I answered that question. So that's it. I answered all the questions. And like I should always say at the beginning, but almost never do, if you have any questions about things you think I could be able to answer, like early Buddhism, Theravada Buddhism, monastic discipline, meditation, Eastern philosophy, some Western philosophy, just religion in general, me personally, Burma, etc., etc. If you think I could possibly answer a question that you would like to know the answer to, feel free to include that question in the comments below. No more than 3 questions per episode, please. And like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. And be happy.